China's concerns about addressing energy security are driving a wedge between what it is doing and what it has been saying. China positions itself as a climate champion, but in reality, it has been the world's largest annual emitter of carbon dioxide for almost 20 years. As of 2 years ago, China had emitted more carbon historically than the entire European Union. Despite building 2/3 of solar wind capacity under construction globally and bringing nuclear power online faster than any other country, China's coal consumption also continues to grow. China has made misleading promises to stop financing coal-fired power plants internationally, yet it does not appear to be on track to meet any of its own domestic emissions targets in 2025. This gulf between China's stated objectives and its domestic actions raise questions about whether the party is putting its finger on the scale to enforce its purported policies, or whether it is letting energy security, political pressure from coal producers, and tensions between electricity producing provinces and electricity consuming provinces get in the way of what is promised. More importantly, cast doubt on whether China's international commitments to peak emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060 are indeed credible. I want to again thank my fellow commissioners for their participation and our witnesses again for their thoughtful testimony, as well as our hardworking staff for all their support in organizing today's hearing. Before introducing our first panel, I want to turn the floor over to my colleague and co-chair for this hearing, Commissioner Hal Brance.
Thank you, Commissioner Goodwin, and thank you to our witnesses for participating in the hearing today. China has emerged as a pivotal force in international energy infrastructure and clean energy technologies. Its dominance in renewable energy technology, energy transmission, storage, and related supply chains threatens to create strategic leverage for Beijing and security risks for America and other countries. Today, among other issues, we'll consider China's emergence as a top financier of foreign energy infrastructure. Chinese policy banks and state-owned enterprises are funding and building power generation and transmission projects across emerging and developed economies. As with telecommunications nearly a decade earlier, officials in capitals around the world are now investigating the risks of Chinese investment and control over critical electrical infrastructure. Indeed, as the 2021 National Intelligence Assessment warns, Chinese manufactured hardware could introduce hidden vulnerabilities such as remote kill switches and data collection capabilities. Recent intrusions into U.S. infrastructure by state-sponsored actors like Volt Typhoon serve as a stark indicator of both Chinese capabilities and intent. When the United States raised concerns about these cyber operations last December, Chinese officials reportedly linked these activities to geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, a sobering reminder that energy infrastructure has become a potential battlefield in great power competition. Yet critical minerals are perhaps the most vivid illustration of how Beijing leverages its central position in energy supply chains to support state interests. China secured a dominant market position through decades of state intervention. Now, recent restrictions on rare earth exports and mineral processing technology reveal a willingness to weaponize supply chain dependencies for strategic objectives. Moreover, China's application of export restrictions on refined critical minerals shows an evolution in both the sophistication and the assertiveness of its economic coercion toolkit. Security of energy systems is vital to U.S. and global prosperity, as well as for the ability of U.S. and allied militaries to operate around the world. China's growing influence as a supplier, builder, and in some cases owner or operator of energy infrastructure raises difficult questions about resilience, diversity of supply, and international cooperation. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues, and I welcome their suggestions of steps Congress can take to mitigate these challenges.
Thank you, Commissioner Brance. Our first panel will focus on China's energy ecosystem and growing needs, and we're pleased to welcome Mikkel Maiden, who's the head of the China Energy Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Prior to joining OIES, Dr. Maiden headed cross-commodity China research at Energy Aspects, and previous to that, she headed China Matters, an independent research consultancy providing analysis on the politics of energy in China. Welcome. Also pleased to welcome Mr. David Fishman, a principal at the Asia-Pacific-focused energy consulting firm, the Lantau Group, where his areas of expertise cover regulatory and economic intelligence for the Chinese power sector, including solar, wind, coal, nuclear, hydro, as well as transmission, grid, and power market issues. Prior to joining TLG, Mr. Fishman was the managing co-director of the nuclear energy-focused consulting firm, Nicobar Group in Shanghai. Welcome, Mr. Fisher. And finally, we're pleased to welcome back Dr. Erica Downs, a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, focusing on Chinese energy markets and geopolitics. Dr. Downs previously worked as a senior research scientist in the China Studies program at CNA Corporation, an analyst at the Eurasia Group, a fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, an analyst at the CIA, and a lecturer at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing. Welcome back, Dr. Downs. Dr. May, we'll begin with you and we'll remind the witnesses to try to keep their remarks to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Commissioner Goodwin, Commissioner Brands, distinguished members of the Commission, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to testify here today. In my talk, I'll focus on China's changing energy ecosystem and highlight a number of emerging trends that I think could be quite transformative and therefore merit some consideration. First, as Commissioner Goodwin just mentioned, China's electricity demand is growing at a rapid pace and for a variety of reasons, right? Like in many other parts of the world, this includes AI, data centers, cooling demand, industrial activity, a growing part of which is associated with clean tech manufacturing, but significantly because China is electrifying its economy. So it's replacing fossil fuels in transport and in some heating processes, and there is scope for more of this. Already, electrification in transport is displacing oil, and the pace could be faster than markets anticipate. Fuel switching is also happening in the passenger vehicle segment, where gasoline demand is declining, but in trucking as well. So we're seeing a shift to LNG, but increasingly also to electric trucks. These trends will continue, and they could accelerate because EVs and batteries are a strategic industry for the Chinese government, but also because the market is big and fiercely competitive. In many vehicle categories, EVs today are cheaper than traditional ICE vehicles. And they're also pretty cool to drive in, and there's a lot of innovation that happens through consumer preferences. So China's electrifying rapidly, but it is also decarbonizing. It's adding record amounts of wind and solar to the extent that installed wind and solar capacity today exceeds coal and gas installed capacity. Now, of course, installation and utilization are not the same thing. Renewable integration into the grid still faces numerous challenges, the most significant of which is the institutional bias in favor of coal. There is still a perception in many quarters in China of the need to rely on coal to deal with the intermittency of renewables. Coal plants are being retrofitted in order to provide this source of flexibility, a role that gas typically plays in a number of economies, including in the US. Power markets in China are designed in a way to prioritize coal. Now, there are efforts to change this, they're slow, they're gradual, and it will take time to phase out coal, but renewable manufacturing and deployment will continue. This is a dynamic that could also impact gas demand in China. Gas today is consumed in industry more than in the power sector in China, but demand is growing in both these sectors. However, going forward, it could grow more slowly than expected, especially if prices are high and domestically sourced fuels, both coal and renewables, are available to mitigate some of the external vulnerabilities associated with gas imports. So renewables will also continue to be manufactured and deployed because these are strategic industries. Beijing has for many years encouraged the development of the industries of the future, sort of clean tech, AI. And today, what is known as the new three industries in China, electric vehicles, batteries, and solar panels, have become important drivers of economic activity and of energy security. These are home-developed, if not homegrown industries, where Chinese companies have a strong footprint throughout the supply chain in some upstream activities overseas, but they do remain reliant on imports of minerals, metals, and ores. So dominance does not mean independence. But if we take all these factors together, we're seeing the emergence of an energy sector that is shifting increasingly to renewables and coal. This energy system has redundancies, it has inefficiencies and high costs associated with it. There are weaknesses and vulnerabilities, distortions related to the strong role of the government in administratively set prices as they push back against market dynamics. There are different stakeholders that are pushing diverse agendas. But on the whole, this is a system that increasingly will be able to support optionality in fuel switching. It can also support a low-cost and increasingly a low-carbon footprint industrial machine or industrial activities. It ticks, therefore, a number of policy priorities: economic growth, industrial competitiveness, geopolitical leverage, energy security, and over time, emission reductions. So what does this mean for the US? What could the US do? I think, first of all, we need to keep monitoring and understanding the dynamics in China through research, through hearings like these, but more, through exchanges with a variety of counterparts, but also partners in China. It's important to maintain a deep understanding of these trends, the motivations, the actors, Access to reliable data is always a bugbear and becomes even more significant now as we need to understand the speed and the scope of change. For instance, if oil demand in China is falling faster than expected, that will have implications for supply-demand balances, for global oil prices. As oil product demand is peaking and Chinese refiners are shifting to petrochemicals, this also impacts prices, margins, and then investment decisions. Prices, understanding pricing mechanism in China are key. We need to understand how prices are set in the different sectors, where they are administratively set, and how market prices interact with that. What are the fuel switching thresholds between gas and coal or renewables and other sources? What are the input costs that inform the Chinese industrial activity? All of these are important for us to then make policy decisions, but also for corporate investment decisions. There are also areas where there's room for collaboration on technical areas. CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage, is one area of common interest, as coal is going to remain a part of the energy mix, even though it's declining. Storage technologies, flexibility in power markets are other areas that China is grappling with, and many other countries are grappling with as the system evolves. Fundamentally, though, I think the US needs to decide if and how it competes with China on these new technologies. We say industries of the future, but they're industries of today, and China is leading in many of them. And I think we have to bear in mind that China's lead is the result of years of supportive government policies, but not just subsidies. And that has created and strong competition domestically that has enabled the creation of vertically integrated supply chains, industrial clusters, manufacturing hubs. These are complex ecosystems that support innovation and talent, of which there is plenty in China today. So there's also plenty of clean tech capacity that will continue to find its way to other markets. If it doesn't go to OECD markets, it will go to emerging economies. So the energy landscape in third countries is also changing as China invests in mining and refining, but also in selling clean tech. It shapes the way countries are thinking about energy security and industrial competitiveness. I think the US needs to think through if and how it engages in that thinking, but also in that competition. How much of it is done in collaboration with China, in maybe learning from some of the technology, getting potential technology transfers from China, but of course with other partners in third countries as well. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing my co-panelists and to the Q&A.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Fishman.
Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you, Commissioners Goodwin, Brands, and all members of the Commission. Today, I would like to take the conversation a little bit farther forward. So, of course, we start by taking a look at what has happened now or what is happening in the next few years going out to 2030. That's, of course, China's deadline for its carbon peaking. But then really what happens after 2030 is what I think is worth focusing on for the longer perspective. And that's where I get to talk about the topic I was asked to discuss, which is really focusing in on heavy industry and industrial decarbonization, the insertion of electricity, of green hydrogen, or failing those two options of carbon capture into the heavy industry decarbonization process. My core message here is that independent of short-term investments into the energy-intensive industry, plants still getting built. And certainly energy-intensive industries still expanding, like coal chemicals, for instance. China is currently laying the groundwork to be able to achieve dominance, not just in those current, three industries, the solar panels, the batteries that were just mentioned, but the next wave of clean tech. The clean tech meaning the green hydrogen, the electrolysis of green hydrogen, meaning the insertion of electricity into certain fossil fuel industrial processes, and the carbon capture. And this will have profound global climate and economic consequences. These technologies will come into especially clear focus after 2030, as they are in the demonstration phase right now. And they will both rely on and build upon the already considerable advantage sometimes that China has built in the foundational clean tech areas like wind turbines, solar panels, and hydrogen electrolyzers. Taking a look at where we are for electricity, even as we get closer to what would potentially be an energy peak, perhaps by the end of the decade or in the early years of the 2030s, there's really no expectation for an electricity peak. And that's really an important distinction to make, that as energy peaks, as petroleum consumption comes to a peak, as coal consumption starts to come to a peak, that electricity will continue to play a larger and larger role as it is inserted into every single aspect of the industrial economy and of the power generation sector, naturally, so that Chinese electricity demand continues to grow all the way out to 2030, 40, 50, maybe even out to 2060. Look, to be able to do that, to be able to continue increasing electricity demand and continue increasing the contribution, or at least holding stable the contribution that heavy industries are able to play in the overall Chinese industrial economy, but still be able to commit to slowly decarbonizing as is stated and as intended to be happening between 2030 and 2060, there must be some trick, right? There must be some way to balance that out. And the way that it looks like it will have to be balanced is to be able to look at some of those most fossil fuel dependent, heavy industry, fossil fuel centric processes and be able to swap them, substitute them for something else. Looking at some of the ways that that will be achieved, or that the groundwork is being set for those right now, we can take a look at some of the broader climate and electrification policies that are directly affecting heavy industry right now. We talk about policies like the carbon dual controls policy, which has been in place for a few years and is now slowly ramping up to become more of an aggressive force for heavy industry to be able to be held to certain energy intensity and then later carbon intensity benchmarks set on a national level and then distributed out to provincial levels. We take a look at the renewable portfolio standard, a requirement for first provincial power entities to consume a certain minimal renewable power level, and that also getting spread out to heavy industries like steel, cement, petrochemicals, that they will be held to a minimum renewable energy consumption level just to be able to operate. We look at the emissions trading scheme, and we look at the rollout of this national emissions trading scheme that is also now pulling in some of those heavy industries like steel and cement and aluminum, with the expectation that they be able to cap their emissions at a certain level, and if they exceed those, that they have to pay for carbon. And then finally, we look at some of the things that are going on in the power generation sector, specifically when it comes to coal-fired power plants. Yes, indeed, they will continue playing a pivotal role even as the renewable sector expands, even as renewables become the major server of power consumption growth in the coming decades. The coal will still be there. And if the coal still has to be there, how can it be as clean? And, maybe there's no such thing truly as clean coal, but how can it be as clean as possible with efficiency updates, with high efficiency boiler retrofits, with incredibly low usage of coal per kilowatt hour of power generated? All of these very niche, leading edge industrial applications currently taking place in China, and in China really leading the world in some of these niche applications. And then we look at the actual industrial applications for heavy industry. We take steel, for instance. Are we going to be able to introduce more electrification of steel? Are we going to be able to insert green hydrogen into the steel production process? The answer probably is yes, and the demonstrations are happening in China. When we take a look at carbon capture, are we going to be able to apply carbon capture to the production of cement? Because cement has certain unavoidable emissions associated with limestone calcination. Can we do those? The answer is yes, and it's demonstrating right now in China. When we take a look at aluminum and the production of aluminum being very energy intensive, an awful lot of electricity. Can it be done with green electricity? Yes, that's demonstrating a demo project right now in China. Can we swap out the carbon anodes in aluminum for inert anodes instead and remove those emissions? That demonstration project is also happening in China. Right now, all of the 2030 to 2040, 2050, 2060 industrial technology applications that have to be mastered in order to decarbonize heavy industry. They're demonstrating them right now. Are they all going to be successful? No, of course not. They're expensive. They're incredibly expensive when we're talking about electricity, when we're talking about hydrogen, carbon capture. Some of them will fail, but these are part of the overall broad industrial strategy. They have the full backing of the state. When they are named demonstration projects, they have backing to ensure the risk is taken out of them, and increasingly the successful ones will find their way to the top. They will float their way to the top. The way I see it right now and what I'm tracking in the world is that really China and some European companies have pulled out to a pole position in applying these technologies. And unfortunately, from what I see, the United States is at critical risk of falling behind. I do hope some of the recommendations in my testimony can be considered to that effect about how the United States can engage with China and some of its other partners around the world and try to make sure it stays part of that critical technology transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fishman. Dr. Downs.
Right, sorry, better? Okay. In my remarks, I will address three issues: China's slowing oil demand growth, changes to China's oil imports, and developments that probably have enhanced the country's security of oil supply. I'll now turn to China's oil demand. China's demand for oil, long an important driver of global oil demand growth, is decelerating. Between 2003 and 2023, China accounted for more than half of the increase in world oil demand, growing at an average annual rate of 5.8%. However, China's oil demand grew more slowly last year, with industry sources estimating a growth rate between -2% to 2%. And these same sources expect China's oil demand will continue to grow more slowly this year. There are several factors contributing to the slowdown. These include increasing sales of new energy vehicles, the property sector slump, increasing deployment of trucks powered by LNG, and the continued build-out of China's high-speed rail network and subway systems. And I'll say a few quick words about each of these. First, turning to new energy vehicles, or NEVs, these are displacing demand for gasoline. New energy vehicles include battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell electric vehicles. And China's national oil companies estimate that NEVs contributed to a decline in China's gasoline consumption last year, and that they will contribute to a decline in China's gasoline consumption this year. Second, China's property sector downturn is almost certainly displacing diesel demand because diesel is used to fuel construction equipment and transport construction materials. Third, the increasing deployment of trucks powered by LNG is displacing diesel demand. And here again, China's national oil companies estimate that LNGs contributed to a decline in China's diesel consumption last year and will do so again this year. And finally, the continued build-out of China's high-speed rail and subway systems and the increasing use of them is also displacing oil demand. The International Energy Agency recently estimated that oil displaced by NEVs, LNG trucks, high-speed rail, and subways allowed China to avoid 1.2 million barrels per day of oil demand growth since 2019. I will now turn to the second topic of my remarks, which is changes to China's oil imports. Last year, China imported 11.1 million barrels per day, accounting for more than 70% of the country's oil consumption. China's top 5 suppliers provided 2/3 of China's oil imports last year, and the 5 countries in descending order are Russia, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Iraq, and Oman. China imports oil by land and by sea, and last year about 90% of China's oil imports were seaborne, and Russia accounted for almost all of China's overland oil imports. A number of changes have occurred to China's crude oil import portfolio over the past decade, and especially the past few years, and I will highlight 5 of them. The first is that crude oil subject to U.S. and Western sanctions probably accounted for more than 1/5 of China's oil imports last year. And this pool of crude oil includes barrels from Iran and Venezuela, as well as oil arriving from Russia on sanctioned tankers. And the main buyers of these crudes are small independent refineries known as teapots. The teapots operate on thin margins, and they are attracted by the discounts they can obtain on crude subject to sanctions. Second, the emergence of Malaysia as China's third largest oil supplier last year reflects oil imports from Iran and to a lesser extent Venezuela, which are rebranded as Malaysian in origin. Last year, China imported 1.4 million barrels per day from Malaysia, but Malaysia only produced 565,000 barrels per day. And the difference is due to oil from third countries that are delivered to China via ship-to-ship transfers in the water off of Malaysia. Third, Western sanctions have helped make Russia an even larger supplier to China than it was before the start of the war in Ukraine because of the discounts available on Russian crudes. Between 2021 and 2024, China's imports of Russian oil increased by about 38%, and Russia's share of China's crude oil imports expanded from 17 to 20%. Fourth, the growth of China's imports of sanctioned crudes almost certainly contributed to the 10% decline in Saudi Arabia's oil exports to China between 2021 and 2024, as well as the reduction in Saudi Arabia's share of China's crude oil imports from 17% to 14%. And fifth, Africa's importance as a crude oil supplier to China has declined over the past decade, with its share of China's crude oil imports falling from 19% in 2015 to 9% in 2024. And this is primarily the result of reduced imports from Angola, Sudan, and South Sudan, all of which have seen their oil output decline. I will now turn to the third and final section of my remarks, developments that have probably enhanced China's oil supply security. Now, to be sure, oil supply security remains a concern for China because of its high level of import dependence, but there are several developments that may be cause for some comfort in Beijing. First, China's domestic oil production is increasing, and this growth is actually rooted in a decline in China's oil output between 2015 and 2018. In the summer of 2018, Xi Jinping issued an instruction calling for stepped-up efforts to find and produce more oil. China's oil companies respond, and they invested heavily in production, and China's oil production grew by 500,000 barrels per day to 4.3 million barrels per day in 2024, which was close to that 2015 level. Second, the rapid growth of new energy vehicle sales means that China's oil demand may peak earlier than expected. China National Petroleum Corporation, for example, now thinks China's oil demand could peak as early as this year. Third, China can store a large quantity of oil in its commercial stocks and its strategic petroleum reserve. Specifically, China has the capacity to store about 2 billion barrels of oil, which would provide it with about 6 months of import coverage at the 2024 level. And at the end of the first quarter of this year, China probably had about 3 months of import coverage at the 2024 level in storage. And I see that my time is about up, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Turning to Q&A, we'll go in alphabetical order, but taking the prerogative of the chair, I'll kick us off. Dr. Maiden, you had mentioned the unique pricing mechanisms in China. And in some respects, they're administratively set, and others, they're informed by the market. Curious as to how that works in practice, and then how price informs, influences, or even undercuts stated policy.
I think we probably need a whole day to talk about the pricing mechanisms, but the point I was trying to make also is that we don't know enough about exactly how they work. We know that there are state-set prices for oil products. Natural gas is set sort of at the city gate level, but within that, there are market fluctuations and sales that sort of take that as a benchmark and can move up or down. The state-owned companies have, again, these city gate benchmark prices. They can sell above contract or beyond contract. There's a hybrid system, right, of state-set prices and then prices that are allowed to fluctuate in and around that. So the point is that it's very complicated, and it changes depending on oil products, on sort of natural gas, power. Imported volumes can be negotiated directly. Some of the sort of LNG, for instance, is negotiated directly between seller and buyer. Pipeline flows have a city gate cap prices. the point is that we need to understand these, because I think then we can understand what are the fuel switching levels. The LNG markets have been looking all last year, at sort of which price point do Chinese buyers come in, and at what point is that fuel switching. And it's different for diesel and LNG and in the power sector. So at what price point does gas displace coal and vice versa? But that's also where we need to understand the power pricing mechanism as it feeds the industrial system. What is the price of electricity that industries are paying? And they vary, and they can be subject to incentives and support measures. But the short answer is we don't have a good understanding of these pricing mechanisms, and I think we should.
Thank you. Let me ask a question about the grid in China and grid reliability. All this investment and innovation in new technologies, new energy technologies, might not matter if you can't efficiently store, distribute, and transport the power. So what are the biggest challenges facing transportation and distribution of electricity in China?
As I mentioned in my remarks, I think there are institutional barriers that are the most formidable. You can talk about limited physical grid infrastructure, which China is building and adding, but not fast enough. You can talk about the inadequacy of storage. Again, China has a lot of battery storage, pumped storage that it is investing in and building out, although they may not be enough. But it is the institutional barriers. It's the limited price reforms. It is the fact that every province has long-term coal contracts that it has signed, long-term power contracts that are based on coal, and this disincentivizes the use of renewables on a sort of pricing and market basis. Now, every so often we get increased curtailment. The government comes in and sets mandates to increase the use of renewables. It sort of tweaks the signals and the pricing mechanisms to offset different losses. So right now there's a new pricing mechanism that will come in June that will price renewables slightly differently. I think essentially the aim is to give the grid a bit more money to invest in more of these physical bottlenecks. So again, there are physical bottlenecks and there are institutional bottlenecks. I would argue that the institutional bottlenecks are the biggest concerns. But sort of in response to that, China's overbuilding, and every province is overbuilding capacity. I mean, we're seeing Guangdong province, which has a lot of renewables, adding a lot of coal capacity that it doesn't need in terms of peak demand. But every province and every leader wants to have energy supplies that are sort of guaranteed. And so there are those two elements that come in together, but there are solutions and this kind of whack-a-mole of policies that try and deal with inefficiencies.
Thank you. One more quick question for the panel. As we alluded to at the beginning, there's some questions that some commentators have raised about whether China will be able to meet its international commitments to peak emissions in 5 years in 2030 and then become carbon neutral by 2060. I want to invite reaction from all three of you as to the likelihood that they'll be able to meet those commitments.
I mean, maybe I'll start. They are likely to meet certainly the 2030 commitment because they've pledged to peak emissions. They haven't said at which level. They haven't set an absolute cap for emissions. There used to be talk about earlier peak, but their ability to sort of reach a threshold and then start to slow it afterwards is highly likely. The 2060 targets of net zero, of reaching carbon neutrality, I think are much more complicated. And just this week, President Xi said that they would look at all forms of carbon emissions, all forms of emissions, not just carbon. That is much more complicated by the use of the current predominance of coal in the energy mix. But here, too, the metrics are quite vague. So there's a bit of room to play around with what carbon neutrality actually looks like. But in terms of the renewables that they've added to the grid, they should be able to meet sort of power demand, for instance, through renewables. It then comes down to the mechanisms and some of the additional measures that David Fishman was talking about.
I'm already over my time, but Mr. Fishman, Dr. Downs, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I could jump in here. Yeah, look, in 2024, China added about 650 terawatt hours of new power consumption. That's a lot of electricity. They added an entire Germany and then some of new power consumption. And about 86% of that was met by clean sources, wind, water, solar, nuclear. And again, a massive amount, 500 terawatt hours. And yet it's not enough. Right? Even adding 500 terawatt hours in 1 year of new clean generation was not enough to meet the demand of the Chinese economy and the Chinese people for more electricity. And of course, they're the largest power consumers in the world. On a per capita basis, it's quite average. It's not especially notable how much the average Chinese citizen consumes for electricity purposes, which is just to say there's so much space to use more electricity still. And going forward, it will get a little bit easier to meet all of that new power consumption with clean sources. The base is getting larger, right? The actual amount that's growing each year, the real estate sector is not going to be demanding as much. Hopefully coal chemicals slows down a little bit. And then overall, we get to a point where clean energy is able to meet 100%. And that's how you get to the peak, right? That was mentioned. Yeah, peaking, no problem. How do we stop peaking from becoming a plateau and actually start declining? That's really, I think, the key question that both internationally should be asked and China domestically is asking itself. And that's where we get into some of the things where I was talking about the industrial decarbonization.
Great.
I agree with my panelists that the peaking by 2030 is likely. And I will just add that China typically tends to set targets that they expect to be able to meet or exceed. And in this case, they certainly know that the rest of the world is watching.
Thank you. Commissioner Brands.
Thank you. Dr. Menon, I wonder if we could just come back for a moment to the issue you mentioned about the need for reliable data, and if you could just say a little bit more about what the source of the problem is. Is it that there's too little data and it's too opaque? Is it too much data and we're swimming in it? And what would we need to do to get a better handle on the issues that you're talking about?
So for some of the issues, there is too little data and it is imperfect. I know that the IEA is working with the Chinese authorities, with the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, of getting better quality data. I mean, the data is available. And they're pretty good at publishing supply-side data on a monthly basis. But what it actually means is a question, and so some of that needs clarification. Demand data is limited. There are a few consultancies, and so there's a few paid for data sets that are available, but they're inconsistent. Again, you don't know what they entail and what they mean. So for all of these things, establishing a baseline, even when you look at gasoline demand in China, different institutes have a different baseline, let alone the decline rate. We don't even agree on where China is today in terms of its demand. So some of it is improved data out of China, triangulating with other sources of data, but making data more free and available, especially, I think, in the critical mineral space for pricing and for the flow and trade of commodities would be very helpful.
You also mentioned in your statement the need for the U.S. to cooperate with third parties if it's to compete effectively with China in these areas. Could you just say a bit more about that? What are the key areas, who are the key players, and where do things stand at the moment?
And if we're talking about new energy supply chains, they are very vast. And I think there has to be a choice here in which supply chains. If you look at battery and electric vehicle supply chains, right, they go all the way from a variety of nickel, cobalt, manganese, lithium, all the way to the processing, the anodes, the end products. Similar story for solar panels and wind turbines. I put a very simplified kind of schematic representation in my testimony, and even that simplified. So I think the first decision is which industries should the US and allies compete in. Maybe some are not worth sort of all that investment. Then, because they are so deeply integrated, these supply chains, the collaboration has to go from the upstream, I think, through the midstream and to the end market. So again, if you look at battery chemistries, for instance, if the leading battery chemistry is going to be NMC or LFP, that determines which of the minerals and the commodities are going to be needed. So miners need to know what the demand market is looking like. It needs to have the pricing information and the knowledge of what's happening, but also the midstream infrastructure, which is all in China. So the US has a lot of the attributes or the potential for China with these integrated and sort of manufacturing hubs and industrial clusters. The US is perhaps the only country that has the landmass, the resources, the skill base, the talent to do these sort of very big industrial clusters. But partnering with other countries and thinking through that supply chain and where are the comparative advantages to at times collaborate with China, but also create new and diverse supply chain sources, I think there have to be certain choices that are made.
Thanks. Dr. Downs?
Yeah, I'd like to come in on the data issue. I spend most of my time looking at data for China's oil and natural gas in terms of demand, production, imports. Certainly agree with what Mahal said, that the data, there's not as much data out there, I think, as we would like on the demand side, that China's government, every month publishes data on oil and natural gas production. They publish data on imports, but there's no official number for oil demand. And, to Mahal's point about different actors in China having different baselines and different numbers, in my written testimony, I include projections from several entities inside and outside of China of China's oil demand in 2024 and 2025. And there you can see that the two biggest oil companies in China have slightly different numbers. I will also add that one area where there has been, a decline in data availability is a breakdown of China's pipeline natural gas imports by country. China's General Administration of Customs used to publish this monthly breakdown of volumes on its website, and they stopped doing that after December 2021. I think you can still get a aggregate number. You can get the dollar value, but in terms of figuring out, how much is coming from Russia, how much is coming from Turkmenistan, that's no longer available.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Meiden, I wonder if I could start with you. You make the observation towards the end of your written testimony that China didn't start out, or didn't at the outset have a strategy to dominate the mineral supply chains that they currently dominate. Could you give a little insight into the evolution of Chinese thinking on this question? Did they at some point decide that, in fact, that was a desirable objective for strategic reasons? When was that?
I think the evolution of these different supply chains, as I mentioned, started off in very different ways. So solar was built as an export industry, whereas wind turbines were built as a domestic industry. Electric vehicles and batteries had sort of energy security in mind. And they were started off by different ministries, different actors, as a vision, and I think there was a vision of sort of strategic emerging industries and industries of the future back then that China would like to lead in and maybe leapfrog Western competitors, because it knew it couldn't compete with ICE vehicles, so it went to electric vehicles. It knew in telecoms it couldn't compete in 2 and 3G, it went to 5G. So there were different policy strands for developing these industries over time, and at the same time there were policies for minerals. But China doesn't have a list of critical minerals, for instance. It has strategic emerging industries, minerals, sort of the way it classifies it is slightly different. It also has advantageous minerals, which are minerals that it possesses that other countries need. So it did recognize pretty early on that it had an advantage there and a potential for leverage. But over time, as these industries emerged, gradually sort of China was doing rare earth extraction, and then there was a desire to capture more of the value add, so they moved into the midstream. There was a progressive move by both government and companies to become central in these supply chains. I think the realization that this is a powerful tool is quite recent. I think sort of ever since there is a perception that relations with the US are in decline, there has been a greater ability to coordinate among ministries, and to look at how to use this sort of policy toolbook. But here too, I think we do need better understanding and more analysis of where is the policy toolbook and where is the corporate toolbook. Like, we know that Chinese companies can impact lithium prices when there are big investments that are coming online, and therefore disincentivize Western investments. Now, is that a corporate strategy or a central government strategy? Probably a corporate, but we need to understand it better. But there is now, I think, an emerging sort of toolbook that the Chinese are starting to practice and fine-tune.
Thank you. Dr. Meiden and Mr. Fishman, I'd like to ask you the same question. Dr. Meiden, you mentioned, used the term leapfrogging. Is it correct that, would it be a correct summary of a very complicated situation to say that China has effectively dominated the first wave of green technologies, got an early start, focused on this, deployed subsidies and so on, and that it would be very difficult or impossible for the United States or other advanced industrial countries to catch up? First, is that accurate? And secondly, a next wave, a coming wave of green technologies. Mr. Fishman, you referred to that. Are there opportunities there for the United States or other advanced industrial democracies to leapfrog? Are there areas where we should focus if we can't catch up? Are there areas where we could get ahead in the next couple of decades? So, Mr. Fishman, maybe I could start with you.
Sure. Right. So none of these technologies, or very few of these technologies, originated in China, right? When we talk about going from 0 to 1, the 0 to 1 sometimes happened 5 decades ago in the United States or in Europe. But when it got to 1, maybe that's where it got stuck. And then China took it from 1 and they iterated it to 10 and then 50 and then 100. And that's where we stand now with solar panels, perhaps, or lithium ion batteries. And because of the way that has been constructed and because of the early lead that in some cases I would argue was squandered, I would consider it to be very difficult to catch up in batteries, for example, or solar panels. When we talk about the next wave, we are on the edge of that. So when we talk about whether or not ethylene crackers or green hydrogen or whatever it is going to be competitive, in most cases, there's a European company that's doing it right now. There are 10 Chinese companies that are doing it, and there's an American academic institute that wrote a fantastic paper about it, but they can't find the funding to deploy it. That's what I see playing out many times. So I think the United States absolutely has the fundamental research to catch up, or to keep up, not to catch up. But right now is not getting the right ecosystem that it would need to de-risk some of that early stage deployment.
I don't know if we have time for Dr. Mike to give a very brief response.
I just add to that, I think there is a question of leapfrogging might be hard, but growing the pie, right? There is demand for a lot of these industries and these industrial products, and there's room for many other countries to produce them. And critically, we need diversification of supply chains. Geographic concentration is not a good thing, and therefore more of everything is important. What we are seeing is that China has led in what we call sort of manufacturing-intensive technologies, so things that need to be scaled up. There's been a lot of process innovation, and with that, China has been very good at reducing cost and by growing scale. Design-intensive technologies are a bit more complex, things like hydrogen and the more complicated systems. There are areas to work with China, but also to lead the efforts in design and innovation. As David was also saying, there's a point where you have a breakthrough technology and you need to scale it up. China is typically the market where you can scale it up. So there's, I think, growing the pie, and then there's leapfrogging, but there's certainly room for more innovation and more of everything.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Goodwin. Dr. Fishman, I want to go back to the one point you just made about innovation and thinking about Europe and the companies there, China and the companies there, and then the American academic. Have we seen anything in the space of joint ventures or forced acquisitions or anything like that? And the reason I asked the question is during the last hearing, I think we had on space, one of the witnesses talked about this company called KUKA Robots, which is this German advanced manufacturing company that had this incredible technology. And over the course of a series of years, the Chinese basically bought a portion of the company and then did a hostile takeover. So are we seeing anything similar in this space on solar panels or any of the other advanced technologies in the sort of next wave that you just talked about?
I will, out of respect to my fellow panelists, I will correct to say that I am not a doctor, so I can't claim that one. But yes, the current wave of technologies, or rather the next wave, the next big thing, so to speak, they exist mostly in academic form. So for Chinese companies to be referring to something, they are developing alongside the existing European companies, and they are all drawing from theoretical and academic work. That there wouldn't be much to grab from or to requisition when it comes to looking at electrifying ethylene crackers. No one's done it yet. The first one maybe is happening in Europe, and the second one is happening in China, and they're happening at the same time because we've gone past the point where we have pre-existing technology where you could even consider some type of corporate espionage or ill-gotten goods, something like that. It's just happening now. It's new now. Everybody's got it new now. And China's developing it because they're throwing tons and tons of money and state support and smart people at it. And so is Europe. Sometimes in partnership, more often independently, from what I've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Fishman. Dr. Downs, I hear an echo. The data issue that you talked about, while it's opaque to us, I assume the Chinese have near perfect data on their side of the curtain. Is there anything that we can assume or extrapolate through their actions that we couldn't see in the data? No, I don't have an example in mind, but if I have perfect data and you have bad data, there are actions that I'm going to take that are going to drive me to make certain investments and certain actions. They're obviously not going to be reflected in the data you see, but they might be reflected in other places, in investments that we're making. Perhaps it's in what Dr. Fishman talked about. But it just seems that if you have a data advantage, you would be driving certain industries to go, a specific way on some of the grid switching issues, on price points. Dr. Maydon was talking about, where that switch point is and things like that.
I'll have to think about that. But
all right, that's fine.
I'll
keep moving.
Turn the floor over to my fellow panelists if they have something to add, and then maybe something will come to me.
I don't think they have perfect data.
Yeah.
I think certain people within the system have data. CNPC, in their reports, they use NBS data, and internally they use their own internal data, but they don't coordinate with Sinopec and CNOOC and their peers. They're actually really interested to talk to people who talk to all three because they don't have each other's data. I don't think that data is systematically transmitted to the government either. That's why you have a lot of various consultancies in China that make a lot of money selling to US corporates. There is absolutely no way to validate where that data comes from.
That's helpful.
That's helpful.
And
I could make a comment here about data in the electricity sector, because that's my sector. I'm in electricity. And the data in the electricity sector is incredibly siloed. It's very much on a need-to-know basis. And whether you don't know the data doesn't mean no one knows the data. When it comes to, for example, power trading entities, if you are a power generator or a wholesale power buyer, you have access to tons of power pricing data in the power exchanges that I can't access because I'm not a trader in the power markets. And so when a developer chooses to build a solar farm or a wind farm in a certain location that to me looks like it should be a really bad call, I try to do my napkin math and I think it looks like a bad investment, and they're seemingly going ahead with it. I, in those cases, assume that they have more data than I do, and it is driving them to act in a way that I can't understand.
Mind if I get one more question in? Dr. Maydon, you at the end of Dr. Freeberg's question said that there are areas where the U.S. and the West should consider not competing. You stopped short of saying what they were. I have my own ideas, but I'd be fascinated to hear yours. And then as we think about the sort of next wave and other sort of subcomponent technologies, are there areas where we should think about doubling down in terms of our investments, our sort of research and development activities? Be interested in you sort of finishing off that line of thought.
It's a really difficult one. I can give you an example from Europe, not so much from the US. I think for Europe, for instance, investing in solar panels makes little sense. The US has an offshore wind industry, it has an auto and battery industry with limited funds and the limited ability to de-risk, and there is going to have to be some government support. The solar industry doesn't make sense anymore. I think for the US, it does make sense to invest in the solar industry because there is a big and thriving solar industry. The auto sector is big. Maybe the offshore wind or wind is not a priority sector, sort of when you think about national, sort of domestic energy demands and the domestic energy outlook. So I think that's one way to look at it, of how do you triangulate the areas where you are going to need the energy, you are going to have the demand, but also have already expertise, and it is worth investing in more. Again, in terms of technologies, I think there's electrolysis, electrolyzers, and hydrogen are an area that is still, I don't like it when people say, is the race already won or is the race over? Because, again, the market is growing and there is demand for these technologies and there's room for a lot of innovation and a lot of growth. And I think also we need to differentiate between the different sectors and what we need. Disruptive technologies are great for, AI and for military defense. I think in a lot of the energy space, good enough technology that is low cost is impactful. Solar panels that can be deployed quickly, electric vehicles that compete with ICE vehicles or that can, encourage mobility, that's good enough. You don't have to be at the frontier of technology. And again, what we're seeing from China is that a lot of the innovation happens through scale, manufacturing hubs, industrial clusters that are able to have this sort of feedback loop between producer and consumer. So I think it does merit more in-depth thinking about which technologies and which sectors of priority.
Thank you very much.
May I come back on the data question?
That's up to Commissioner Goodwin.
Okay.
Quickly.
Okay. I just wanted to add that in the oil sector, I think agree with Mahal, there is imperfect data. And I think, one of the reasons for that is if you look at what's going on in the refining sector, you have a lot of players. Like the big national oil companies do control a majority of the refining capacity, but you have a lot of other refineries in this space. You have large plants, but you also have a lot of small teapot refineries. And over the years, it's been very difficult to get a handle on exactly, sort of how much capacity they have, how much throughput they have. And I think in some cases, some of these smaller refineries probably have had an incentive to conceal some of that information. So basically just wanted to elaborate on the point that even in China, not everybody necessarily has access to all of the data that they would like to see.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you all for your excellent testimonies. I'd like to look a bit into the future right now. Mr. Fishman, you mentioned a number of innovations in your testimony, including injecting green hydrogen into steelmaking. Can you explain to us how that process works and also what potential hydrogen overall has in terms of China's energy mix? Any of the rest of you are welcome to contribute to the second part hydrogen discussion.
Sure. So looking at process emissions, and trying to figure out where the fossil fuels are and where they can and can't be substituted. The ones that are easier, at least from a technological standpoint, to substitute are your heat processes, right? Anything where you were combusting something because you just needed the heat for high temperature or medium temperature applications. You could be either electrifying that with, electric boiler, or in the case of green hydrogen, you can be combusting hydrogen in place of the fossil fuels or co-firing with fossil fuels to get your heat. So when we're talking about extremely high temperature applications for steel, for example, of course, one avenue is to go for electric arc furnaces, but you could also choose to keep your blast furnaces and instead co-fire with hydrogen instead. And if that hydrogen was produced through electrolysis from green electricity, then you have green hydrogen and therefore you have green steel. So as long as you are introducing it into the blast furnace pathway, then you have the opportunity to introduce hydrogen to steelmaking.
I can move on if no one else has a hydrogen point. We've read earlier this year about the artificial sun that China's created. I'm curious because fusion has been mentioned relatively little in this conversation in the testimonies. I was wondering what you think, what all of you think about the future of the fusion sector in China. What is the significance of the artificial sun project? Is this something that's high-profile propaganda, or is it something that's really meaningfully moving to something in the near term? Anyone's welcome to start.
Well, I was asked to try to be ready to answer some questions about fusion, so I did take a little bit of a look into that. So yeah, the artificial sun out of one of the institutes of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Now they have been a support institute for the International Thermoelectrical reactor project out of Europe for about 20 years now. They've been one of the member countries and been contributing a lot to that project over the decades, but they've also had their own domestic exercises. And with what was referred to in the news as the artificial sun, I believe that was a plasma containment exercise, I think was what it was being referred to there. And in that case, they successfully contained plasma for 18 minutes, I think was the number at the time, which was quite a milestone. At the time, it was the longest containment of plasma ever. I believe since then it has been exceeded by a French institute that did it for 2 minutes longer or something like that. China does have fusion in its long-term energy strategy, but it's a long shot. It's not written in there until 2030 or 2040, perhaps even. There are no promises to develop fusion in the next 3 years or 5 years. I know there are some commercial developers in the United States that have a much more aggressive timeline. China takes a much more long-term view on the potential for fusion, and whether or not it will eventually be part of the energy mix right now is far too early to say. But I would say at the moment, it doesn't look like it's put into the blueprint for the energy transition. It's just something that's interesting. We'll see if it works. We'll invest in it quite significantly. They're spending supposedly over $1 billion a year in R&D on their fusion projects, but that is certainly not a core part of the energy transition at this point.
Thank you. I see my time is ticking down, but I wanted to have one last question. Most of the projections that we're talking about are based linearly on what we know from what China's doing. What is the most out-of-the-box development you can envision that would affect China's energy mix in the future? Realistic, but out of the box, that may change everything we're talking about today. Dr. Maiden.
It's a really good question, a really hard one. I think, as you've been saying, all of the projections are based on what we already know, but we're not keeping up with the trends. If we look at electric vehicle penetration, and you look at historically at some of the renewable deployment, every year the IEA and others were revising up because the scale of deployment and penetration was faster than we expected. Which is why I'm also saying that electric vehicle penetration, if we keep at current trends, or even slightly accelerate, then gasoline displacement would be faster than anticipated. Renewable deployment could very well be faster than anticipated. And so these fundamental sort of systematic changes that I tried to sort of lay out are based on sort of extrapolating to maybe last year's trend and not 5 to 10 year trends. And that's where a lot of the models do struggle to, and I'm not even talking about disruptive change, right? There are disruptive changes on the demand side. There's other scenarios that we can think about if the Chinese system became efficient, sort of in terms of incorporating market efficiencies or demand side efficiencies. There's lots of gains there. But I think one important message is that the past is not a good enough indicator already.
I'm over my time, but I don't know if anyone else has a particularly interesting zinger for out-of-the-box developments. All right.
We'll come back for the zingers. Chair Price.
Thank you all very much for participating today. This is very interesting. The most important thing we do is create recommendations for policymakers. So I want to go back to that. Several things have been alluded to. Mr. Fishman, you have recommendations in your written testimony. I'm going to start with you and ask you to pull out what you think is the most important of those three recommendations that you've made. And to Drs. Downs and Maiden, you've alluded to certain things that you would do in answer to other questions. I'm going to ask you to give me what your recommendations would be or your priority moving forward. So, Mr. Fishman? Oh, we don't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I will briefly mention the third one just to set up the first one. The third one is involving gathering better intelligence on what China is doing currently, what its current capabilities, intentions, strengths, and weaknesses are. I think there is a persistent gap in what is available and knowable, even from public sources, and what is known and how that is incorporated into strategic thinking on the US side. And then building upon that, which was my third recommendation, my first recommendation, that there has to be an acceleration of US infrastructural ecosystem level support for the next gen industrial clean tech deployment, getting it out of that R&D phase, getting it out of academia and into deployment, and crucially providing the right levers and the right systems that de-risk these efforts, because if you leave it up to our financialized world of short-term returns, of asset managers, of investment banks looking for certain returns on certain timeframes, these things will never get built. They'll never get done. It needs a certain de-risking in order for the 0 to become the 1 and then the 1 to become the 10, to use my metaphor from before. That's my key recommendation. Enhance the environment to allow builders who want to try out some of these projects, to try out some of these technologies, to build a demo and see if they can't get it going.
Thank you. Dr. Downs or Dr. Maiden?
I'm happy to come in.
Okay.
So one recommendation that I have is to monitor changes in China's oil demand and imports and how those changes impact China's relationships with its key oil suppliers. So as China's demand for oil and its oil imports peak, plateau, start to decline, who among China's major suppliers are the big winners and the big losers? And what does it mean for China's relationship with these countries? And then what does it mean for the United States? And so thinking about who might win in the future. I mean, one country I would point out is Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Aramco has been not only investing in more petrochemical projects in China with an eye to producing some of those materials needed for the energy transition. And that's also a way to lock in demand in China. But we're also seeing the energy relationship between these two countries broaden beyond oil to include renewable energy technologies, especially solar. But there also have been, big investments announced last year between Chinese companies and the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund for the manufacture of wind turbines and solar panels and storage in the kingdom. So, I'll stop there. But basically, I do think it's worth paying attention to how these changes in oil demand and imports impact China's relationships with other countries in the world and what all of that means for the United States.
Thank you. I'd like to reiterate the point about understanding and knowledge. Our conversation just now also highlighted issues of data and price. We spend our time looking at the data, at the issues, and we spend a lot of time on it, and we're nowhere near understanding it completely. That has to continue, sort of those efforts, both to get better data from China, but also to triangulate from external sources, including from perhaps the corporate and the business sector. It's not just the data, it's also the information about how things work and the different interests and the different stakeholders. Different parts, again, the business community, the policy community, have interactions with counterparts in China and overseas, and understanding how that all fits together is really important. It does perhaps lend itself to a sort of whole of government approach or a better or sort of coordination internally within the US. Because sort of going back to that data issue, some of the issue with independent refiners that we have bad data is because they're doing tax evasion. And this is a challenge for the Chinese government as well, but we all need to figure it out. So better understanding. I think when the US thinks about infrastructure support, which sectors to de-risk, I think there has to be, as I sort of started saying earlier, a more holistic view of what is feasible, what is realistic, which areas are worth sort of keeping, saving, and leading. And there's, I think, a difference between leadership and scaling up and deployment. There are certain sectors, again, which are to be sort of discussed, because there are trade-offs, right? You can't have everything. You can't have infrastructure for everything and leadership in everything. So which are the sectors that the US can lead on, and perhaps hydrogen and, again, next generation of some of these clean technologies. But there is also a race to just have these infrastructures and technologies. Just want to point out that, scale and size and cost reductions matter. If you look back at the history of solar panels, it was thin film technology in the US, then China came in, scaled up polysilicon. Now that is the dominant technology. Battery technology started as NMC, then China came in and is doing LFP. That's the dominant technology. So what is the race, or sort of what are we getting to? What are we trying to get to? And then what are the trade-offs? Because not everything is achievable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Smavonian.
Thank you. Dr. Maiden, you note in your written testimony that China's industrial sector makes up a large share of their energy use. And we've also heard that China is seeking to rapidly towards industrial decarbonization. Can you talk about the interaction between those two items and what that might mean long-term over the next 5-10 years for China's energy mix and use and dependency?
I think, that the priority now has gone from, if we were to rank sort of decarbonization, that is now much lower in the ranking because it's all about economic growth, but also economic resilience and the ability to compete with the US and potentially with the West. And that will happen, I think, in Beijing's view, through the leadership in these industries and technologies. So that is the main focus. It is making sure that these industries are fueled by whatever it takes, be it coal, be it renewables. But over time, because renewables are also an industry and they contribute to economic growth and activity within China, and they are a way to deal with decarbonization. The European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism might be watered down a little bit now, but it's still there. And so that threat of carbon tariffs exists and is pushing for steel sector decarbonization and other efforts at decarbonization. So over time, I do think we will see greater decarbonization in the mix, so a reduction of coal, much more wind and solar. It's an open question about how much nuclear and how much hydro, but the question is really wind, solar, and coal. And probably China will electrify much more rapidly than it decarbonizes, but it is laying the groundwork for a system that is low carbon, that is quite low emission, and also can deliver on this industrial growth.
Thank you. I noted that there wasn't a lot of discussion in the testimony around nuclear, green hydrogen, geothermal, geologic hydrogen, some of the other energy sectors where the United States has competitive advantage or we're investing heavily, such as in green hydrogen. A lot of these technologies and sectors also draw from the oil and gas industry and a lot of the technologies of the oil and gas industry. So we have indigenous and inherent expertise in those areas. Dr. Downs, Dr. Maiden, can you talk through both China's interest in those sectors and also where we might have competitive advantage and what that could mean long term?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I've looked at geothermal and green hydrogen through work that I've done examining how China's national oil companies are preparing for a future in which less oil is consumed. Geothermal is one area where they have been active. They are planning to do more in this space. And this is also true for green hydrogen. Sinopec, which is China's largest oil refiner, back in 2021 set the goal of becoming China's leading green hydrogen company. It's worth noting that Sinopec is already a leading hydrogen company, but most of its hydrogen production is from fossil fuels. But they do have some big projects that they are working on, both in terms of producing green hydrogen, in terms of a pipeline. And I think a big question for the company is, does it have what it takes to be the leader in green hydrogen? This is a wide open space. It's a new industry. So you have a lot of companies rushing in. And, there are renewable energy companies in this space that, may be better positioned to succeed. But certainly it's an area where a lot of companies in China are interested in becoming bigger players.
I think just to add very briefly, I agree with everything that Erica said. I guess when you look at the kind of system-wide picture, these are small parts of the picture, but they're not absent. I think the Chinese policy is sort of all of the above and invest in all of these, and it had a lot of geothermal activity and investments happening that are continuing. In terms of hydrogen, there has been more policy support since 2021, 2022. I mean, there's been a long-standing hydrogen policy for fuel cell vehicles that has sort of been ongoing in tandem with electric vehicles, but electric vehicles sort of won out. The shift in 21, 22 became more focus on hydrogen as a tool of decarbonization with a focus on green hydrogen, and with the availability of excess renewable capacity that is curtailed in some provinces, those are being redirected into green ethanol, green hydrogen. I think there is a lot of potential there. It might not be spoken about because it's a variety of companies, but these are, as I mentioned earlier, these are sort of design intensive technologies, so not the easiest for China to take and scale. I mean, they're already quite advanced in alkaline electrolyzers, so in the industrial component of it, but not in PEM electrolyzers, where there is scope, for the US to remain leader. And if we think about these industrial hubs and clusters, well, then hydrogen clusters in the US are potentially worthwhile sort of pursuing and advancing.
Thank you.
We can kick off a second round. Mr. Fishman, I have a question about the role of AI and data center construction in increasing demand. Obviously, seen a lot of press coverage about the growth of AI in China and around the world, and the impact that has on consumption and demand. With some commentators indicating that it's set to quadruple in China over the next 10 years, and suggesting it's growing at an alarming rate. My sense from your testimony was that you didn't seem very alarmed, given the overall growth of their capacity in China. So wanted you to react to that. And then also, just for context, provide some comparison to the growth of AI and data center construction here in the U.S. relative to our capacity.
Yeah, sure. When it comes to the challenge posed by the rise of electricity consumption for AI, the key thing to remember is that China has had year-on-year power consumption growth of 6, 7, 8, 10% for many, many years. And so when it comes to this new driver of power consumption growth, keeping power consumption growth high, keeping it at, well, these days it's maybe 5% or 6%, it's just another thing that makes you need more electricity. By contrast, I think the response in the United States has been a little bit more of consternation, because for many years, power consumption growth rates have been very, very minimal, or maybe even flat. And so when data centers mean we need to rise by 1.5% or 2% year on year, this becomes a considerable challenge. Whereas in China's case, it's just another thing. Now, of course, it's a big thing, and it means that electricity consumption will keep growing when maybe it would have flattened out a little bit more. But the infrastructure, the mechanisms in place to ensure that those data centers are going to be using as much green electricity as possible are also already going into place. So putting those data centers into the renewable portfolio scheme means you can only locate them in some cases in a few provinces. Sometimes they have to be close to the compute center, but the ones that can be put far from, they don't have to be so reliant on being close to the compute cluster. Those can be out in Inner Mongolia or Gansu. They can be happily soaking up some of those extra renewables that we were just talking about. China has indeed quadruple. I've seen numbers saying anywhere from 500 terawatt hours to 1,000 terawatt hours by 2030, going solely to data centers. Now, again, for context, 500 terawatt hours, that's a Germany, and 1,000 terawatt hours, that's a Japan. So between a Japan and a Germany of power consumption going just to data centers, but in China's world, in the scale that China's working with already, it's manageable, it's doable, it's just another thing that you have to prepare for. So I do think they're handling it a little bit differently, and and they're more prepared to be able to scale up in that way.
Thank you. Let me switch gears and talk a little bit about the supercritical coal-fired power plants that you discussed in your testimony. As you described them, these plants are more efficient and subject to stricter emission standards than comparable coal-fired power plants here in the U.S. Wanted you to talk a little bit more about what those stricter standards are and what they actually govern in terms of emissions. And then you also suggest that putting more of these supercritical plants online could actually reduce emissions. Now, that presupposes a lot of things about the grid mix, what else is available. So we'd like to hear you expand on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm having trouble with my mute button. Right. So when it comes to those ultra supercritical plants, they're being built, in the last 5 to 10 years, really. They are the newest technology, and they are being expected to operate in the reality of the new power mix, which is one that increasingly is using solar power during the day and maybe has wind power in the evenings, and it needs coal to be able to fill in all the gaps and to be able to operate, as was mentioned before, a lot like we would operate natural gas-fired power plants in the United States. China doesn't have a lot of gas, it has lots of coal, so it's going to operate its plants as if they were gas plants. These newest plants, the ultra supercritical plants, are the culmination of many, many years of iterating and improving the efficiency of the existing fleet. And what it comes down to is that when all of those coal plants are competing for dispatch, competing to sell electricity and to be load followers and to complement the wind and solar, they're going to be competing with each other. They're going to be competing for capacity markets against batteries and nuclear and other coal plants. And in the end, the ultra supercritical plants will be more efficient and operating a lower cost, and they'll beat out the subcritical plants. So that's the future that looks like. It's a dog-eat-dog world for coal plants in China, and the ultra supercritical ones will surely be best positioned to win.
Thank you. Anybody else for a second round? Commissioner Kagan.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Goodwin. I don't really usually get a bunch of energy experts and electricity experts in front of me, so let me talk through a scenario, and then I'd just love to hear the reaction of all of you. So China is reportedly going to have about a terawatt or more of solar panels coming off the line every year. They're also building nuclear power plants. We're trying to build power plants. I was recently told that nuclear power plants are sort of a critical piece of any sort of electrical grid as we think about data centers and sort of the challenges of the future. If China's building a terawatt of solar panels, Dr. Maidan, and we go back to your point about saying, maybe it's not worth investing in solar, how should we think about the Chinese power grid and the American power grid and what that mix looks like? Should we go all in on everything? Should we prioritize where those investments are made as we sort of invest in data centers and we see this continued race to artificial general intelligence? Or should we go all in on one particular solution? And I said Dr. Maidan, I don't intend you to be the only person to answer the question. Everyone's welcome to chip in. And zingers remain welcome for my friend, Commissioner Miller.
I mean, the Chinese and US grids are very different. I have to profess I know very little about the US grid. So the starting point is different, and therefore, what you're trying to achieve is very different. My understanding of the US needs, as David was saying about AI rising, there's a lot of transmission infrastructure. There's a lot of sort of the physical stuff, right? There's adding nuclear, adding gas, adding any form of energy that will allow firm dispatchable capacity. And so how you decide on those investments, I think they have to include the physical infrastructure and the grid infrastructure to be able to deliver on that. China is doing an all-of-the-above approach where nuclear is a small part of what it will be able to deliver in the future. It's doing also battery storage to be able to fuel that growth. But it is a very different sort of mix, and it's a very different, I guess, provincial layout, because in some of these industries, as sort of David was saying, they are going where the energy supply is. So I think the US should be looked at on its own merit with the view to resilience, flexibility, and I think down the line, a lower emission grid, because the world is going towards more carbon tariffs and carbon accounting on industrial products.
I'll jump in here. The United States has a fragmented grid. We have RTOs, right? We have not one grid, but rather 8 to 10 grids, sometimes regional, sometimes individual states. And that is going to continue to define how each region meets its electricity needs. We can't expect to, I'm from New England, we can't expect to ever be having a solar powered NEISO. It's just not going to happen. We can maybe expect to have a solar and wind powered ERCOT or CAISO, but it's never going to happen up in the Northeast. So as long as we continue to have a very fragmented national grid or no national grid like that, every region is going to need to be defined by what makes sense for that region. China, on the other hand, is hoping to build a national unified grid. It will take a very long time and it will be very difficult, both for the physical and commercial mechanisms to be put in place. But someday when that's all built, you can imagine that coastal needs for electricity are met by wind power generated on the other side of the country and transmitted to the coasts where they're needed. So China will be also taking a different approach where we're saying we can do all of the above, we can build everywhere all at once, but we're also going to send it everywhere that it could theoretically be needed. It's going to be monstrously difficult, larger than any grid anyone has tried to build before, a huge, huge challenge, but they're looking at it quite differently. The United States, I don't think, is moving towards having an integrated national grid anytime soon, and so it's going to continue to be restricted by regional capacity for what makes sense in the region where you're located.
Chair Price.
Thank you. I have just 2 quick clarifying questions. The role of hydropower, does anyone want to comment on it? It was mentioned once, I think, briefly, but I'd love to hear that. Mr. Fishman, maybe? You're shaking your head.
Sure. I've been talking a lot, so I wanted to give a chance for some of the other commenters to speak. But yeah, hydropower, there's a lot of hydropower in Southwest China, especially as long as it can be transported out of Southwest China and to other places where it's needed. Of course, it will be very useful elsewhere. Currently, a lot has been built. So while we're not exhausted necessarily, while China hasn't built all the hydropower it possibly could, it's probably getting pretty close. There's at least a few more very large projects that will be on the 10 to 15 year horizon. And then at that point, it seems like most of the accessible, readily developable hydropower resources will be exhausted. That being said, it's still on the order of hundreds of gigawatts, so quite a lot, but getting close to exhaustion.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Medan.
Maybe just to add on the hydropower point, it is very vulnerable to climate change. And so we've seen droughts and issues in Yunnan and some of these provinces that are rich in hydropower that are building backup capacity of renewables and other because of the concerns of the impacts of climate change on the availability of hydropower.
Thank you. I want to go back, Dr. Medan, to one thing you also said, switching to coal. In response to Commissioner Goodwin's first question and institutional barriers on coal, you mentioned something about long-term contracts, but is that the sole institutional barrier, or is there something else that's keeping them in the coal business?
I mean, the power contracts are an important part of this because there's a guaranteed revenue and there's, but local governments also know that they can rely on the coal industry, and the coal industry is a big employer and a big political stakeholder. So it is important well beyond the sort of market contracts. It is able to maintain a strong role, and increasingly as the world is looking geopolitically more volatile, then China's leaders fall back on coal because it is domestically produced and it is locally available. So I think it is obviously much deeper than contractual terms.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your time and your testimony today. We're going to take a quick break and we'll return at 10 after the hour for our second panel. Thank you.
Our next panel will explore the risks to the United States and its allies' national security from reliance on Chinese components and materials in critical energy infrastructure. We'll start with Ms. Kate Logan, Director of Climate Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute and Fellow in the Center for China Analysis. Ms. Logan will discuss how Chinese energy-related lending is being eclipsed by investments in overseas manufacturing and exports of clean energy technologies. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Patrick Miller, President and CEO of Ampic Cyber. Mr. Miller will address recent Chinese cyber operations against the U.S. power grid and risks from both cyber actors and reliance on Chinese energy equipment. Then we'll hear from Mr. Brian Manel, Chairman and CEO of TechMet. Mr. Manel will speak to how China became the global leader in critical mineral mining and refining and the challenges Chinese control of mineral processing poses to U.S. attempts to diversify supply chains. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Corey Combs, Associate Director for Climate, Energy, and Industrial Policy at Trivium China. Mr. Combs will discuss how China uses its asymmetrical leverage in critical materials over the United States and strategies for the U.S. to loosen China's hold on the American economy. Thank you all very much for your testimony. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks, and I ask that all of our witnesses please keep their remarks to 7 minutes. So, Ms. Logan, we'll begin with you.
Commissioners Goodwin and Brands, distinguished members of the Commission and staff, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. My remarks will focus on China's overseas energy footprint, including its infrastructure, exports, and manufacturing investments. I'll focus on 3 key points, followed by policy recommendations for Congress. First is that the crux of China's overseas energy engagement has shifted from public lending for traditional energy infrastructure to commercially driven exports and manufacturing of new energy technologies, especially solar, electric vehicles, and batteries, which China collectively refers to as the quote-unquote new 3. For many years, China's global energy footprint was defined by large-scale, state-financed infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. However, since 2021, sovereign lending by China's 2 main policy banks for energy has dropped sharply, amounting to just $737 million from 2021 to 2023. This is less than 1% of the total value of all loans from when the BRI was launched in 2013 through 2020. In addition, President Xi Jinping's 2021 pledge to halt financing for new coal-fired power abroad has largely held up. While there are a few loopholes for coal developments that are still proceeding, no major new projects have been announced, and over 40 gigawatts of proposed coal capacity has been canceled since the pledge, avoiding roughly 4.5 billion tons of cumulative emissions. By contrast, in 2024, China exported $177 billion USD worth of new energy technologies and committed $58 billion USD to build overseas manufacturing facilities for these products. These factories have a potential annual output value of $111 billion USD once they are complete. This pivot reflects a deeper structural transformation within China's economy. New energy industries, most of which are private enterprises, have become key growth engines, comprising over 10% of China's GDP in 2024 and driving more than a quarter of its economic growth. Second, as the US and other countries adopt trade restrictions, China will increasingly seek markets that impose lower or no barriers, many of which are in the global south. China's overcapacity in new energy industries is a structural feature of China's economic policymaking that is unlikely to be resolved through external pressure alone. While this has made clean energy incredibly cheap, it has also caused challenges for companies to turn a profit. As a result, companies will increasingly court international markets to stay afloat, especially in the global south where demand is growing and trade barriers are less prevalent. For instance, last year, the value of EV exports from China to global south overtook those to the EU. Trade restrictions have also accelerated China's foreign direct investment into overseas manufacturing capacity. Initially, many companies were looking to circumvent tariffs by producing their new energy products in third countries. But this FDI is increasingly pouring into countries that are also looking to leverage China's clean energy know-how and technology while deriving economic benefits and creating local jobs. Third, the rising influence of China's new energy industries is now driving Beijing's political and diplomatic priorities. For instance, in a special address at the World Economic Forum this January, Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang emphasized China's dominance in new energy supply chains while extensively promoting green products and technologies. And at last year's COP29 climate conference, China cited over $24 billion in climate-related finance to developing countries since 2016, breaking from precedent to frame China as a constructive global player. China is also growing its contributions to multilateral development banks, thus elevating its influence in these global institutions. These actions all support expanding markets for China's new energy companies. Now, let me turn to 3 policy recommendations for Congress to consider, which aim to enhance U.S. resilience and prosperity in light of China's new energy dominance. First, Congress should commission an updated report assessing the risks and trade-offs of decoupling supply chains from China for critical new energy technologies that U.S. states and other countries are looking to source, given their economic and energy transition goals. By understanding the level of dominance of Chinese companies, extent of supply chain leverage, and resources that may be required to compete with Chinese enterprises, the U.S. could better cater its economic and industrial policies. Second, based on this analysis, the U.S. should adopt targeted incentives toward technologies where U.S. companies may still have a cost-competitive opportunity to rise into key market players globally, such as advanced geothermal, solid-state batteries, and energy software. Existing tools like DOE National Labs and the Battery Workforce Initiative should be strengthened, with additional resources put toward R&D, as well as demonstration and deployment, especially in global markets. Where U.S. domestic production would be prohibitively expensive, a different approach may be needed. Policymakers could reconsider trade barriers while investing in strategic rainy day manufacturing reserves that could be activated during supply disruptions. Platforms like the Mineral Security Partnership could be leveraged to expand processing capacity for critical resources toward which the U.S. is working to secure greater access. At the same time, the U.S. should consider where and how Chinese investment might benefit the U.S. economy. Streamlining the vetting process for Chinese FDI in new energy manufacturing, especially when paired with robust technology transfer agreements and other conditions, could help the U.S. benefit from China's expertise, create local jobs, and foster innovation. Third, to remain a credible player in the global energy transition, the U.S. must not cede multilateral spaces to China. Staying in the IMF and the World Bank is not enough. Congress must continue supporting their investments in new energy, otherwise risk relinquishing ground to Chinese-led MDBs like the AIIB and NDB. Reauthorizing the Development Finance Corporation and expanding its equity investment authority could help bring U.S. new energy companies into emerging markets and support the nearshoring and friendshoring of critical new energy supply chains. This is vital for maintaining a constructive U.S. presence in regions where China is becoming more active. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Co-chairs Goodwin, Brants, commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Patrick Miller, President and CEO of Ampix Cyber. For more than 25 years, I've worked in cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, focusing primarily on the electric grid. I've worked extensively with electric utilities of every size and function, in addition to collaborating with key federal and state agencies, as well as major industrial hardware and software suppliers. I was one of the original contributors to the NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection, or CIP standards, and the first CIP auditor with delegated federal authority in the U.S. My remarks today draw from direct field experience assessing and mitigating cyber threats across the energy sector. Let me start with a clear message. The cybersecurity threat from China to the U.S. energy grid is real, growing, and strategically motivated. This is not about isolated intrusions or espionage. It's about a persistent effort to position for potential disruption in a time of crisis. China is preparing the digital battlefield. Over the past several years, threat reporting has consistently pointed to Chinese state-sponsored groups targeting critical infrastructure. These actors are not just stealing data, they're embedding themselves into our operational systems. The FBI and intelligence community have repeatedly warned that these groups are laying the groundwork to wreak havoc on American communities if and when the Chinese government chooses to escalate a geopolitical conflict. Chinese-linked groups like Volt Typhoon use what we call living off the land techniques by blending into normal system operation and exploiting legitimate administrative tools already built into operating systems. While larger utilities have stronger defenses, their complexity presents more opportunities for adversaries to hide, maneuver, or escalate. Smaller utilities may be seen as testing grounds, places where threat actors can refine techniques or explore indirect paths to higher value targets through shared systems, contractors, or communications infrastructure. Part of the challenge lies in the age and complexity of our grid. Much of the infrastructure was built decades ago, long before modern connectivity or cybersecurity were considerations. These legacy systems are reliable by design, but upgrading or replacing them is costly and operationally disruptive. Such work requires carefully coordinated outages, even as the grid is engineered for continuous uptime. The risk isn't limited to software or connectivity. Many critical grid components, transformers, inverters, batteries, and monitoring devices now come from Chinese manufacturers and run remotely updatable embedded software. This creates potential vectors for surveillance or sabotage. Simply put, we are increasingly dependent on foreign technologies across every layer of grid functionality and resilience. Concerns go beyond the domestic risks. China has exported its energy technology to other nations through the Belt and Road Initiative. They've built and deployed SCADA systems, grid control platforms, and communication infrastructure around the world, often using proprietary software subject to PRC intelligence laws. This creates backdoors into foreign infrastructure and potentially gives Beijing leverage over our allies during a crisis. To put it plainly, China is playing a long game by using technology and infrastructure as tools of influence and potential coercion. The U.S. cannot afford to ignore that reality. So what can we do about it? First, we need to recognize that a complete rip and replace of all Chinese-made components is not feasible in the near term. We need to prioritize. We should start by identifying the most critical and vulnerable assets, those with remote access, updatable firmware, or high operational impact. Once identified, these components need to be isolated, monitored, and then, when possible, replaced. We should adopt a cyber-informed engineering, or CIE, approach. That means designing systems from the start to limit the impact of a cyber attack. It includes manual overrides, system isolation, segmentation, and operational redundancies. This approach is already being promoted by the Department of Energy and national labs, and it should be mandated for all of the highest risk infrastructures. We also need transparency across the digital supply chain. Vendors supplying hardware or software in grid operations should be required to provide a hardware or software bill of materials, along with disclosures about the development process, code provenance, and sourcing of third-party components. We must continue to expand and modernize our regulatory frameworks. The NERC CIP standards provide a baseline for bulk power system reliability and cybersecurity, but they only apply to larger generation and transmission assets. As our grid evolves, new classes of risk are emerging in distributed energy aggregators, edge-connected devices, and vendor-controlled assets well outside the traditional utility compliance footprint. Some voluntary standards are gaining ground, but currently there is a patchwork of governance mechanisms across the spectrum of grid systems and participants. Addressing these gaps may require new regulatory or compliance frameworks for the creation of modern, fit-for-purpose standards that reflect the complexities and interdependencies of today's electric grid. Investing in domestic manufacturing is essential, but to build in America, we must also secure the raw materials necessary for production. Critical minerals are the foundation of semiconductors and control boards, the essential components in everything from transformers to inverters. Without reliable access to these minerals, our supply chains will remain at risk. We also need to test what we already have, particularly the systems and devices already deployed across our infrastructure that may pose hidden risks. There are thousands of currently fielded devices in substations, control centers, and edge environments whose software and hardware origins are poorly documented or understood. The federal government should fund programs to reverse engineer and thoroughly analyze these systems, especially where foreign developed components are involved. Another essential pillar of resilience is planning for failure. We need to practice what to do when things go wrong by simulating worst-case cyber attacks and mapping the key interdependencies. Resilience exercises should include options like temporarily islanding critical systems to keep them running rather than shutting them down. In conclusion, the security of our energy infrastructure is foundational to national security, economic competitiveness, and global leadership. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing all depend on reliable, secure electricity. If our grid is compromised, our future is constrained. China has made its intent clear. The United States must respond with clarity, urgency, and coordination. That includes smarter regulation, greater transparency, public-private collaboration, and strategic investment in trusted technologies. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Manel.
Commissioner Goodwin, Commissioner Brands, Chair Price, and members of the Commission, thank you for your invitation to testify here today. I'll keep my remarks brief to allow as much time as possible for Q&A, and we have submitted testimony which elaborates on some of my points. As the world electrifies and automates, demand for the critical minerals required for these core technologies is growing at an unprecedented scale. China has established an imposing presence in the mining, refining, and processing of many of these minerals, and now holds significant control over their supply chains. This dominance in the context of broader geopolitical tensions could pose a major risk to the economic and national security of the United States and the world. TechMet is a critical minerals investment company that I founded in 2017. We build projects that produce, process, and recycle the critical minerals needed to secure competitive, China-free supply chains to feed American industry and national defense. TechMet is unique in that we are partially owned by the US government through a series of equity investments by the International Development Finance Corporation, the first of which was in 2020 and the two follow-ons in 22 and 23. The definition of a critical mineral has two components. The first is that the mineral is deemed essential in the manufacturing of a product or application without which there would be serious implications for the economic or national security of the US. For example, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese are the main components of lithium-ion batteries, which power handheld devices, electric vehicles, robotics, and energy systems. Rare earth elements, as we know, are crucial in permanent magnet, electric motors, and defense equipment. The second criterion of a critical mineral is that its supply chain is highly vulnerable to disruption, including through foreign political risk. Of the 50 minerals included in the 2022 final list of critical minerals, the US relied on imports in 2024 to meet 100% of its apparent consumption for 12 of these minerals and had over 50% import reliance for another 28. China was the largest producer of at least 30 of the minerals on the list. China has spent over 2 decades strategically positioning itself as the leading player in critical minerals. Upstream mining projects, often owned by Chinese entities outside of the country, feed domestic processing facilities to refine the products used in local economy and local industry and globally. From 2000 to 2021, China deployed $57 billion in aid and subsidized credit for critical minerals projects. And beyond this, over $100 billion in related infrastructure and debt facilities to countries to secure this dominant position over the minerals that they have built control globally over. One example is the rapid build-out of nickel processing capacity in Indonesia over the past decade, fueled by Chinese investment. Recent analysis suggests that over 75% of Indonesia's nickel refining capacity and mining capacity is now controlled by Chinese stakeholders. There are strong indications that China is consolidating its hold over critical minerals and is prepared to use its position as geopolitical leverage amid escalating trade tensions. They are placing increasingly stringent controls on the export of critical minerals, components, and technologies, citing national security concerns as the reason for doing so. In addition, China continues to deploy capital and cement its dominance, taking advantage of continuing divestment by Western companies. Looking ahead, current low spot prices of many critical minerals are threatening the ability to meet future demand projections. The US faces many challenges in trying to balance China's control of critical mineral supply chains. Ultimately, it boils down to time and money. Critical minerals projects can take over a decade to develop, are capital intensive and highly technical. In the US, private investors are often risk averse or seek more immediate returns on their capital than critical mineral projects offer. This has created a financing gap for Western-aligned projects and made it more difficult to compete with Chinese projects that have access to sources of cheap, long-term funding. The US will need to work with industry to identify and address the barriers to building new production and processing capacity. Access to financing, vulnerability to price manipulation, slow public sector support, speed of permitting, and other regulatory hurdles are just some of the key challenges facing US projects. To diversify supply chains away from Chinese control and build capacity both in the US and across allied nations, the government needs to move much more quickly and invest much more. The US already has many of the tools required to address these issues, both at home and abroad, but they need to be well-resourced, deconflicted, and reformed to address the unique challenges of the critical mineral sector. Reauthorizing the DFC, our shareholders, for a longer period, correcting how equity investments are scored, increasing their investment cap, and expanding the countries in which they can operate would allow us to have a much greater impact. Similarly, reauthorization of EXIM, US EXIM, for a longer period, lifting the current 2% default cap, addressing statutory restrictions, and adding technical capacity could unleash significant support for the critical mineral sector. The Department of Defense has several initiatives and offices that could be utilized to direct funding and purchasing towards areas that would secure American critical mineral supplies and expand production and processing capacity. Likewise, the Department of Commerce, Energy, Interior, State, and Treasury also have programs that could be optimized to secure portions of the supply chain and crowd in more private sector investment. China's dominant position in critical minerals is the result of a dedicated, unwavering strategy implemented over many years, or almost 20 years. Substantial capital deployment in overseas mining projects combined with consolidation of a hugely competitive domestic refining and manufacturing base has given China formidable control of global supply chains, which countries around the world are now reliant on and are very overexposed to. Increasing signs that this position could be used as geopolitical leverage mean that the need to diversify away from China is stronger than ever. This is possible despite the scale of the challenge, but it will require the US to fine-tune and optimize the tools at its disposal to efficiently build out Western-aligned supply chains. Without urgent action, the US could face severe disruption to its economic stability and national security. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Combs.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the Commission, Commissioner Brands, Commissioner Goodwin, Chair Price, for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you to the staff for ushering the witnesses through the process. We're here because the US today finds itself in a position of supply chain insecurity decades in the making. At the same time, due to decades, in some cases up to half a century, of development, China maintains a position of strength with regard to many of the key critical mineral supply chains of interest today. Over the past 2 years in particular, Beijing has sought new forms of material leverage through which to retaliate against and counteract US trade controls in particular. And it has found that leverage in the case of critical minerals. As of now, export controls on critical minerals are a central part of Beijing's playbook for applying that leverage to the extent that it feels its economic interests are threatened. Since 2022, it has instituted export controls, either licensing requirements in some cases or outright bans on exports to the US in other cases, on a total of 16 distinct sets of critical minerals, noting that one of those contains 7 distinct rare earth elements, along with associated production equipment. This process began in mid-2023 under former President Biden's institution of tech controls on China to limit access to certain chip technologies. The response was export controls on gallium and germanium chip minerals. This has accelerated recently, most notably in response to the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs against China, and now is a much more broad-based set of mineral controls. China can maintain significant leverage in stock for future retaliation, and it will continue to use it. The situation has rattled global markets and directly threatened both the supply chains of American producers and key American trading partners, putting businesses, growth, jobs, and overall national security in jeopardy. Now, critical minerals, in terms of their importance, they're unique in the breadth of their importance in many ways compared to other parts of the supply chain. They underpin both energy security and the industries of the future, and as a previous panelist noted, these are future industries that are increasingly the industries of today as the actual growth drivers globally. These include advanced semiconductors, which have proportionally more critical mineral requirements than legacy chips, for example, batteries, electric vehicles, new energy applications of all sorts, as discussed today. They were also vital to national security applications, as noted, from remote sensing equipment, guided missile systems, to munitions and high-strength alloys for vehicles and aircraft. The same sources supply both sides of the equation. Now, with regard to the former, the energy and industrial applications, China's export controls threaten strategic, commercial, and industrial interests in a variety of directions, both contemporary and emerging interests. And with regard to the latter, they drive unsustainable military vulnerabilities. At present, the US government has to decide how will it adapt to ensure the country's energy, industrial, economic, and national security. The long and short is, I think, widely agreed upon that the US needs to diversify critical mineral supply chains away from pure China dependence. The question, however, is how. There are many opportunities here. There's a rich discourse around this question, but I would pose that the best answer has two parts. First is a coordinated industrial development that supports both downstream demand to incentivize private investment in the upstream supplies, which is something we've seen China, in its most successful cases, begin to do, and its least successful cases, it has failed to do. We need the demand side to enable the supply side. Second is through strategic partnerships with allies and strategic economic partners that can not only diversify the access to the geological resource, but also leverage their capabilities, their unique and distinct capabilities, while minimizing the necessary subsidies required to get similar efforts here in the United States and thereby lowering the cost to taxpayers. Diversification of the full set of critical mineral supplies in question is not an easy task. There are 50 critical minerals recognized by the USGS. There are 72 that my team tracks of gallium germanium from zinc and bauxite processing, which means in some cases you have a second-order production issue that you must address. The degree of subsidization required to completely onshore all of this is not exactly calculated, but the short answer is a baffling degree of subsidization. That is not a sustainable way to move forward. However, the US does have certain resources, certain expertise, and a certain degree of subsidization possible, and its partners have many of the pieces to help fill the gap. The US and its partners stand to significantly support each other's diversification efforts through strategic coordination and cooperation. There are two pieces of that I'll reiterate. The first is that the US must incentivize the private sector to build the projects and develop the expertise where we don't have it for more upstream production and processing of minerals. And that ultimately requires, in the medium to long term, the unleashing of industries that will create downstream demand. And again, I would highlight that the military applications are significant, but they're not financially enough to incentivize the wholesale build-out of supply chains that the United States needs for its full set of interests. That is why we need the private sector involved as well. In terms of commercial applications, the global trajectory is moving increasingly toward new energy applications, and that is precisely why China has succeeded in many of its contemporary industrial policy where it has failed in past industrial policy. Namely, it is supplying more of what more countries want, which in effect is a form of energy security in the form of renewables. Most countries are not as oil rich as the United States, Russia, and a few others. And so for them, the ability to have solar panels, etc., has been critical to ensuring their interest. China is supplying what they need. That is where the demand side is coming from, and that is now increasingly supporting and decreasing the pressure on the state upstream as well. The US will find different avenues, certainly, I hope, than China to develop this ecosystem, but this is the end goal to which it must pursue. Now, the second is to balance the scales against China. The US must leverage not only its domestic mineral resources, which are significant but not sufficient. It must leverage all of its resources, and I consider its greatest resources to be its allies and other economic partners. And again, the US alone cannot hope to compete on any particular minerals or downstream growth industries for a variety of issues, including the price issues just alluded to earlier. But alongside the US's many mineral-rich, highly and importantly differently skilled allies and partners, many of whom are also very keen to diversify their supply chains away from China. There we have an opportunity to reduce supply chain risks, seize some of the growth opportunities in the meantime, and address national security risks in the meantime. Ideally at the minimal cost of taxpayer dollars through a big tent of trade and cooperation with our strategic partners. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We will now move to questions, and we'll go in reverse alphabetical order, but as usual, the co-chairs will hop the line. So, Mr. Combs, you have a great timeline in your written testimony of the various coercive measures that the PRC has rolled out. And so we've seen really over a series of years the development and deployment of this coercive toolkit. And so could you just say a little bit more about the evolution of that toolkit over time, how Beijing assesses its effectiveness? And you mentioned that there's a lot of leverage left to be deployed. So what are the next places this coercive toolkit might go?
Absolutely. Several pieces there. First, I would confirm that for China, the mineral strategy in China has evolved. It's very complex. It is different by industry. In the case of rare earths, it started during the Mao era. It was involved with Soviet mining processes. Others are very new. Lithium was not really in major demand until the last 20 years or so, maybe 30. Increasingly, what China was looking to do, and local economies in particular, especially in inland provinces that had few development opportunities, they said, what can we do? Well, we can leverage our natural resources, build more. So it's a supply-led system in that case. And now, in the contemporary geostrategic environment, Beijing has said, what is our form of leverage? What else do we have besides tariffs, which are disproportionately effective from the US side compared to the other way around, and then sanctions, et cetera. And so China, at a national level, has built on these existing advantages in a variety of ways, but most importantly, in the export control side. So a brief background on the export control regime. China's export control regime is, in its modern form, quite nascent. The export control law of 2020 was the first of its kind. Before that, it was a patchwork of different, sometimes agreements with international partners on, for example, non-proliferation. In some cases, it was a direct, block on a particular technology to maintain a strategic advantage in one industry, but very, very narrow, not something that was particularly market distorting. Now, it is a consolidated framework that includes two different lists of controls. One is a list of goods, whereby goods can be very quickly and efficiently added to the list to say, if you produce this, we must track it, and you have to give us all the information about the end user, and we can approve or deny that license. In other cases, it is completely banned. The other side is a list of entities to which the Chinese authorities will not approve, and this is mostly defense contractors. In many ways, a lot of what Chinese export controls look like in terms of the processing is not dissimilar from a lot of the ways that the US and other economies manage. The difference is in the degree of weaponization, driven by the degree of control that they have. So right now, the critical minerals lists are, effectively, when we call minerals critical, it is a political and technical determination. And so it's basically a roadmap to what every economy deems critical. So that's why we look at these first. And Beijing has done likewise. And looking to materially retaliate is effectively a roadmap for how to have material impact. Now, it's also a signal to markets of where investment is needed, of where the demand will lie. And so that is the flip side of the equation I do want to highlight in talking about critical minerals as a concept. But beyond that, I would note that as we move down, we're basically moving down the list of minerals over which China has the most control and are most impactful. And so one of the challenges now is that future controls are getting increasingly complex. We look at the most recent ones. Bismuth is used in just a staggering array of everything from Pepto-Bismol to military applications. It is very difficult to trace all the supplies of that and all the applications and to strategically say, we'll make one investment to support, especially given a very extensive appendix here. I apologize for the page count, but just to list out the degree and the variation in the particular minerals and materials controlled. We expect the complexity of these controls to get even more significant over time. And I would note that there are two different dimensions of impacts, in my personal view, of the controls. One is very obvious. If you need tungsten to make an airplane and you can't get tungsten, the impact is very obvious. The other side, though, is the uncertainty. When we see certain controls like tellurium or bismuth or others that are not necessarily household names, in many cases, it took weeks of corporate and government time, energy, and money to figure out where the supply chains are and what they're needed for. And so that uncertainty itself is a major market driver and a major form of retaliation in itself, and something I'd like to flag as a potentially increasing issue moving forward. Thank you.
And is it fair to say, just briefly, that Beijing is learning as it goes? It's learning about how these controls work. Its understanding is becoming more sophisticated, and so we should expect China to become a more adept, sophisticated user of these controls in the future?
I would agree with that assessment.
Thank you. Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands. Ms. Logan, in your testimony, you talked a little bit about China being able to prove somewhat resilient to some trade barriers that the U.S. has put up by shifting some of these clean energy products and excess capacity to other markets, especially in the global south. Provide a little bit more context on the ability of those markets to absorb that excess capacity. How big are these markets? How much can they take? And then, of course, what can the U.S. do to educate our partners in those regions on the risk?
Thank you very much for the question. So first of all, the overall share, as I mentioned, of China's clean technology exports to the global south has been growing as compared to that going to developed countries. And I think I referenced the example of EVs in particular now eclipsing those going to the EU that are going to the global south. This is to say that some of the Global South countries are, of course, also concerned about the impact of exports toward their domestic economies and China's alleged dumping in terms of how that impacts their ability to derive economic benefits from some of those industries. So you are seeing in the Global South some examples of countries also adopting trade barriers towards some of the exports, including Turkey, India, and Brazil. But I want to draw a distinction between exports and foreign direct investment in manufacturing capacity, because I think those are two different stories. And I referenced in some of my remarks the idea that initially a lot of the FDI was perhaps driven more by attempts to circumvent some of the trade restrictions, but now we're seeing trends where Global South countries are increasingly open to FDI and Chinese companies also as they want to grow their global presence and markets. They're mostly, as I mentioned, private enterprises desiring to actively invest in overseas manufacturing capacity beyond just trying to circumvent some of those trade restrictions. And you see other countries welcoming that and not having the same sort of concerns that perhaps we see in some of the developed countries about welcoming that FDI. So for instance, I referenced in my longer testimony, Brazil, where there have been significant investments from electric vehicle manufacturers in manufacturing capacity domestically, despite some of the restrictions on trade. So I will say still the developed markets are higher end markets compared to the Global South markets, but the demand in the Global South markets for new technologies is growing. And I think a really interesting example as well is how some of these markets are importing products because of reasons having related to their electricity prices in the first place. So I also referenced in my testimony the example of Pakistan, where they imported 20 gigawatts of solar panels from China last year, largely as a result of energy prices from the grid being so high, which in part has to do with Chinese invested coal-fired power plants in the first place, that it's more economical for small, medium-sized enterprises in Pakistan to import Chinese solar panels to power their small, medium-sized businesses, largely through off-grid power, than to continue to offtake from the grid. So overall, I would emphasize that the demand is growing from third markets, though some of them may have concerns from a trade perspective. I would say that the trend then shifting toward FDI will continue, and Chinese companies also have an interest being private enterprises and continuing in that direction.
Great, thank you. Mr. Combs, I want to return to your discussion about investing upstream and downstream and effectively creating demand or investing in demand. In your testimony, you talk about this in the context of the EV industry in China, and note that investments in the electric vehicle industry in China also created a market and attracted private investment into upstream inputs, lithium extraction and processing. And I've heard everyone on the panel say we need a dedicated and comprehensive strategy to respond to what has been a comprehensive and dedicated strategy on the part of the PRC. Does that include investment in the downstream, in creating demand, and recognizing the tension? Just recently, the news noted the cancellation of $1 billion battery manufacturing facility in a U.S. state. And if you go back through some of the press coverage, you'll note some of the same people that applauded the initial investment noted and observed that investing in the EV industry and in battery manufacturing was a matter of economic and national security. At the same time, when the question is raised about incentivizing downstream demand for EVs, the response was, we don't want to distort the market. Consumers should make that choice. How do we reconcile that tension if we intend to craft the sort of comprehensive strategy that you say we need?
Excellent, thank you.
In 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds. Consumers are intelligent. Consumers go toward the best options at the best prices, and there's a balancing point there. What China's most successful, I would argue, industrial policy, let's keep it in the EV silo, was not picking a winner. It was specifically saying the reason we talk about new energy vehicles is because China did not say we will have lithium-ion powered electric vehicles. They said we'll have new energy vehicles because that is the future. But we don't know which piece of that is the future. And so there's a competition around that. And now we have a flood of absolutely with state support and with state guidelines and kind of encouragement. But what that did was create a demand signal saying we will help with licensing, we'll help with the processing of the factory paperwork, all of these things, tax write-offs, whatever it is, fairly standard in many cases, localized in some other cases. But effectively, they incited a competition, one that is still fierce and one that obviously has driven overcapacity issues, which are a related and separate topic. And now we see finally the consolidation of China's electric vehicle industry from 300 down to 100 to now to about 40, maybe 35 real companies left. It'll come down to 10, and the winners will be the most battle-tested of the electric vehicle side. Hydrogen has largely, but not entirely, lost that battle. We've consolidated toward lithium-ion, and now BYD, as of this past week, is opening the battle on sodium-ion batteries. Beijing did not designate any of these pieces. What they said is this is the direction of travel and encourage the competition, and the market won out and consumers picked the winners. I think that is the balance of management from the government side, incentive from the government side, and enabling constructive competition. In historically, when China has failed to enable that, and more often than not, frankly, China's industrial policy has suffered because it doesn't lead to constructive competition. The SOEs are not competitive in most industries. This is where I think the private sector in the US has a better opportunity.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shmivonian.
Thank you. Building off that line of questioning, the United States is really seeking to build out our critical minerals recycling, and we are investing heavily in that, both through funding through the Loan Program Office and other grant-making entities within the government, and also through demand side, through the foreign entity of concern requirements with respect to the 30D electric vehicle credit and other measures. So, Mr. Manel, would like to start with you, and then Mr. Combs, if you'd like to chime in, or anyone else on the panel. Can you just talk through whether the work that we have done so far is sufficient to give investors the level of confidence they need to make the types of investments we want in that space, given the fact that China, as we've seen over and over again, can just turn the dial a little bit and crash the cost of a specific product?
No, certainly China's present market manipulation and oversupply of some of these metals into an already temporarily short-term weak market environment has made building capacity that much more difficult. Certainly financing support for critical minerals and particularly lithium-ion battery recycling on behalf of a number of government agencies has been enormously valuable, and recycling is certainly an important part of the ecosystem that we have to build to secure resilience and critical mineral supply chain security for the United States. But it's not, so it's a part of the answer, but it's not the answer. It's a very difficult industry to make commercial in the short term. You need, even though there are technical solutions for recycling lithium-ion batteries, they're relatively expensive and require fairly substantial volumes of feedstocks in order to build scale that makes them competitive. The landscape for lithium-ion battery recycling have become very crowded and fragmented, partially as a result of the availability of Department of Energy loan program and other support mechanisms, as a result of which the commercial viability and hence scalability is that much more challenging. But even when it does succeed, which it will succeed and must succeed in terms of a fully developed recycling ecosystem for these critical minerals, it'll still only provide a maximum of 20%. This is in 10 years' time, 20% of battery metals and rare earth metal inputs into the manufacture of new batteries and electric motors and other essential components. So it's important, and that does have environmental benefits, it has cost benefits, and it has benefits in displacing reliance on newly mined materials, which are overwhelmingly dominated by China. But it's not the solution. It's a bit of the solution.
I think I'll make a couple of brief additions. Completely agree. one of the issues is there's a severe distinction in the tolerance for low margins between the up and downstream. And I mean, I believe to your point, when we're talking about upstream industries in China, there is a combination of private, hybrid, and state-owned support. But where it's state-owned, they can tolerate the low to zero margins. In many cases, Beijing has actually been attempting to increase prices by restricting, for example, the illegal mining of rare earths, which continue to be a perennial problem. After 20 years, Beijing has been trying to deal with this issue, but it's the local economies, it's entrenched. No local leader wants to cut off revenue and jobs in a relatively low growth, low income environment. And so Beijing, even internally, I would like to recognize that has many issues with price. The infamous quote that rare earths are being sold at earth or dirt cheap prices as opposed to rare prices is something that has driven Beijing's concerns about upstream low margins for a long time. And the state basically absorbs a lot of that cost. On the flip side, where we see private investment, it's in vertical supply chain integration. And that's in the case of CATL and BYD, these battery and electric vehicle leaders, as you referenced earlier, investing in lithium. It's okay for them because the cost, the value is not the marginal value of that, the marginal financial value of that product. It's the risk mitigation they get through that investment. That's the value to those companies. And that's where I say in some case, and this is why all the minerals are very distinct in how they operate, but in the case of lithium, for example, there was certainly a state interest in ensuring supply, but there's also a very commercial interest. And they're willing to absorb that cost because it lowers their risk. So there are a couple different ways you can come at a tolerance for low margins. But in our case, if we do not have either massive state subsidization or companies interested in investing at these low margin, top end in that supply chain, it's very difficult to move forward.
Thank you.
Chair Price.
Thank you. Thank you all for your participation today. I have a couple of quick questions. Ms. Logan, in your recommendation number 3, you talk about not ceding the space at international institutions, but you didn't go into a whole lot of detail about where we might be falling behind. Can you talk a moment about what you're trying to make sure doesn't happen?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So in my longer written testimony, I've referenced the fact that China has been increasing its contributions to multilateral development banks significantly in recent years. I believe in earlier years it was about $500 million per year, but then in recent years as high as $4 billion per year. This is for climate-related financing specifically, but that just reflects a broader trend. And part of what I'm getting at is that these banks are lending in the projects that lead to development for those host countries. And in many cases, those projects focus on new energy technologies, energy transition. So if the U.S. stays within these institutions and wants to lead the way, they need to continue their investments in these new energy technologies and climate investments. Otherwise, China will continue they're continuing to seek opportunities through other multilateral development banks. But also if the U.S. cedes the ground in these spaces, basically China will continue to leverage these spaces for its own aims as well.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, very sobering testimony. So rip and replace not being possible. Your testimony was very much at the 40,000 foot level. Where would you start?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the place to start is essentially with the cyber-informed engineering is one of the first places I would look at when we're designing new systems. The legacy problem is a much different situation. So new systems going forward, we need to look at ways to make them more reliable, more resilient so that we don't have to shut them down. We can continue operating them. We can do that through cyber-informed engineering, which puts in additional controls that are not necessarily cyber and some system in ways like that is one example for future systems. Rip and replace in legacy environments is challenging because for the power grid, you have to take the system down, which is the reason you don't want it to go down. So taking it down to avoid it from going down is the crux of the problem. Designing systems alongside the existing environments, which means you have to have basically two systems, test them, make sure that they work reliably, peel off the old system. That's pretty much how we do this traditionally to keep the system running maximum efficiency all the time. We're running our transmission system at roughly 90 to 95% continuously all the time. There's very little additional capacity there. Now, and there's three basic different systems: distribution, transmission, and generation. So there'll be different approaches for each one of those verticals. Does that come close?
Comes close.
Okay.
I was looking for specifics: water, electrical grid.
Yeah, it's replacing individual components, or since we can't rip and replace, that's the challenge is isolating the ones that we have. Because there's a good friend of mine that calls this living on a diet of poison fruit. We have to continue, but we can't basically just rip everything out. So in those cases, you want to isolate the individual devices so that they can't communicate outbound. They can only communicate locally if they do. And there's even been some discussion around taking what we currently have, reverse engineering it, and finding out if we can actually replace the Chinese software with our own version, so that we can continue to use that machine, that piece of equipment, but not with their software, with ours instead.
Helpful. Thank you very much. For Mr. Mennel and Combs, both of you refer to leveraging partners and allies as we move forward. What would that look like?
Thanks. There are many opportunities. The most basic of which I think would be strategic trade relationships. One of the issues as we talk about an investment side is if investors do not see a reasonable rate of return possible on a project, they're not going to pursue it. And so part of the issue is locking off a market where you have other incentives to trade. That is not simply a kind of generalized tariff regime is probably not going to do the trick, because that's really helpful for moving one source of supply to another, but the other has to exist for that to work. And so what we're talking about more is agreements that are very targeted. Say, if we say with X partner, we will provide you the tungsten that we can produce in, say, Nevada. In return, we want a certain guarantee on imports of cobalt or something, just things of that much more specific nature. And that's something that makes it much more complicated. There are probably better multilateral regimes for this, but in the short term, very specific designated partnerships could be a first step toward understanding. And I have to note, the complexity of these supply chains continues to be an issue, certainly at a high level, but also for many individual companies that are currently doing this at a small scale all over the country. I have dozens of clients who are trying to figure this out right now. Which countries, which companies do they talk to? And so part of the issue is information sharing. They're all kind of doing, in some ways, duplicative work. And I think there is a chance for kind of someone with, namely the government, with a bigger view, and also other strategic interests such as national security, to support in that effort. But long and short, there has to be, there's a challenge of over-prescribing versus leaving it entirely to the market. Neither is quite efficient or effective, as far as we can tell. And so finding that balance is definitely tricky, but I would suggest starting with specific supply agreements.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that domestic production processing alone can't possibly secure adequate supply of these critical minerals to feed US national security and industrial competitiveness. So it has to be a global initiative to secure these feeds. In my view, the solutions are not mineral security partnership type solutions, which is an initiative launched and promoted by the State Department, which is really a diplomatic feel-good exercise. Efforts to build global supply chains to support the United States have to be driven by incentivizing or enforcing allied supply chains rather than relying on goodwill. It's certainly the case that Europe has similar problems vis-a-vis Chinese control that the United States has. And it's certainly the case that the United States is similarly positioned globally and ideologically to Europe with respect to fear of the rise of Chinese dominance and wish to protect sort of freedoms and democracy. However, with respect to, we're entering into a period of structural short supply of these materials globally. Beyond this present short-term market weakness, 2, 3, 4 years out, there's going to be major global structural short supply, China aside, of lithium, nickel, rare earth metals. And therefore, the United States national defense industry, United States industry in general, is going to be competing for scarce resources, not only with China, but with Europe and allies. And that's a reality we have to accept. And therefore, who gets the cobalt out of the Congo between, industry in Germany feeding the creation of growth and jobs in Germany relative to industry in Detroit creating jobs for American workers is going to be determined now by what the United States does in the Congo with respect to cobalt, or in, Brazil with respect to what we're trying to do in nickel to counter Chinese control of global supply of Indonesia. And that requires a much more robust use of carrots and sticks than has been the case historically. So if we take the cobalt in the Congo as an example, they are the overwhelmingly dominant global producers of cobalt. While everybody else was sleeping over the last 15 years, China has built up an overwhelmingly dominant position with respect to control of primary resource and control of processing capacity to take cobalt hydroxides and other materials out of the Congo to China, where they produce high purity battery metal chemicals going into battery manufacturing and everything else. That requires cobalt, including high performance alloys for aerospace and defense. And how do we counter that? We counter that by going to ensure that US aligned interests have preferential access to these resources and flow of product out of the Congo. And we do that with leverage, like the ability to sanction, the ability to provide military and intelligence support in conflicts such as the Eastern DRC. And we do that by creating mechanisms for aligned industry partners to be able to fund, which means offtakes to provide high price floors for critical minerals by the defense, the National Critical Mineral Stockpile and the Department of Defense. It means, what the DFC, our shareholders, can do with respect to financing project development and political risk cover. It's a multiplicity of programs that are, in many instances, there, but need to be accelerated and expanded in order to achieve those ends. And it's not just cobalt in the Congo, it's lithium in Argentina and Australia, and it's nickel in Brazil and elsewhere, and rare earth metals, which are overwhelmingly dominated by both Chinese mining and processing.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
All good. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. I'd like to build off Chair. Mr. Miller, your testimony was rather scary. All your testimonies were very scary. Mr. Miller, your page 7 of your testimony was particularly scary, I thought. You had a section on U.S. reliance on Chinese energy equipment.
Yes.
And you highlighted a significant concern lies with high voltage power transformers, which form the backbone of bulk power transmission, widespread adoption of distributed energy resources such as solar photovoltaics and associated inverters, which are frequently sourced from Chinese manufacturers. As the grid modernizes, energy management systems, smart meters, and advanced metering infrastructure are also increasingly sourced from Chinese vendors. PRC-made control systems and energy storage units nationwide. This is quite a list. You also describe them as long-term strategic vulnerabilities, which of course they are.
Yes.
And we have never been good, as the United States has never been good at getting our ducks in a row to get a strategy on these long-term strategic vulnerabilities. But what I'd like to ask you about are the short-term potential crisis points around this. If we're to look at this not as a long-term plan, which we should have also, but as the potential for this decade, there could be a serious confrontation with China and these things could crash down right away. How should we think through what our options are? I know you laid out a priority or two to Chair Price in terms of what we should be doing, but if we were on a much shorter timeline and actually had a secondary game plan that was focused on worst case scenario, what do we do to make sure that if something bad happens in the next several years, that we are doing all we can in order to mitigate these problems? How would you redirect our attention?
Thank you for the question. That's a complex question. I'm going to divide it into two parts. There is the Chinese threat that is coming in to the utilities to take control of the systems that they have. Those systems may or may not be already Chinese manufactured. They may be manufactured anywhere else. Much of the control systems are manufactured in Europe and some here in the US in terms of where the code is written, for example. Some of the equipment itself is also manufactured here in the US, like Schweitzer gear, for example. So that's one set of problems. The second set of problems is the Chinese-made equipment that makes it easier for the PRC to take over that equipment or misuse that equipment. So those are two separate issues. The first one, where we have Chinese gear, we have to live with it. We have to, as I mentioned earlier, isolate it as much as possible and monitor it extensively so that we know if it's misbehaving in any way. If we can do things like try to repurpose it or reverse engineer it to better understand it. Those are things we can do right now. Now, there are larger install bases of certain types of equipment, so start with those. Obviously, the smaller numbers, worry about those when you can get to them. That's the equipment that's manufactured and made in China that we have to worry about. That's that issue. The part where the Chinese actors are actually accessing our systems and could possibly control our systems, different issue. That is helping those utilities in some way discover that this is someone in their environment, which can be, as I mentioned in the earlier testimony, for the larger utilities, they're very complex. There are a lot of seams, a lot of silos. Smaller utilities, they have lower funding. They typically have lower defenses. Not always, but they typically do. They are often seen as training grounds, but they're connected to the other utilities in lots of ways. So the way you approach those two different organizations will be different. Giving them assistance is a good thing because they're currently trying to do things like keep the power on all the time, 24/7, and they have a very diversified funding streams for how they can do things. Cooperatives, municipals, investor-owned utilities all have very different types of funding for how they can fund their security. So some of those options would be useful as well. That's kind of the two situations I would look at going into immediately. The third leg of the stool is going to be assuming the worst. Just in case things go wrong, we need to be able to continue to operate, even if it means operating in something like a degraded or limp along kind of fashion, but restarting an area of the grid is incredibly difficult. So keeping as much of it lit as you can in islands in ways makes it a lot more useful in terms of its ability to resync and we call it black start, but re-energize areas of the grid.
Good. So thank you. Let's continue our theme of scary, scary, scary. Mr. Manel, Mr. Combs, you ran us through some also scary figures about import reliance on the top 50 or so critical minerals. Thinking short term again, 2 to 5 years, this decade, assuming you were given a high budget and unlimited authority, what would you do in order to secure these critical minerals? And as a big picture look, so from 40,000 feet, what's doable? What share of these minerals could we reshore or friendshore through some sort of new supply chain? In which are we probably going to be screwed? And if we're screwed, then we, of course, have to think about the other side of the equation, which is we have to possibly have offensive capabilities in order to create pain on our adversaries because everybody's going to be in a bad situation. But how would you look through the next 2 to 5 years in terms of the short-term vulnerabilities, critical minerals? What can we do?
Firstly, talking about scary, that the situation is, despite increasing analysis and prioritization in the US since the first Trump administration and growing under Biden and now the new administration of critical mineral supply chain security and the increasing proliferation of government programs to support US-aligned supply chains, the situation continues to get worse every day. You know, every day in this present weak China oversupplied market, projects aligned with US interests are being slowed down or scrapped, and therefore medium-term shortages, 2 years out, 3 years out, are growing every day. And Chinese control over all of these global supply chains is growing every day because they're not slowing down their programs. They're accelerating their investment in nickel production in Indonesia and lithium production in Australia and Argentina and cobalt production in the Congo. So the situation is becoming more urgent and more of a pressing imperative to deal with literally every day. What we do about it is the key, and what we do about it with a 2 to 5 year time horizon is an enormously big challenge because of the long-term nature of a lot of the projects that we need to build in order to supply United States defense and industry in a manner that's not beholden to China with their 20-year head start. And we can't realistically out-Chinese the Chinese. They're very good at being Chinese in terms of cheap government money, in terms of lower environmental licensing standards at home, in terms of the economies of scale and process technology experience that they've built up while everybody else was sleeping. And as was mentioned by Corey earlier, their capacity or willingness to subsidize low margin elements of the supply chain in order to control the supply chain, which we don't really have the capacity to do. So in my view, the answers are not to try and beat China, but to what we can do is out-innovate China. We can out-innovate China like what we're doing in heap leaching of nickel laterites in Brazil to counter reliance on Chinese Indonesia production, like what we're doing with building direct lithium extraction technology so we can produce all of the lithium the United States needs from lithium brines in the Salton Sea in California, from the Smackover in Arkansas and Texas. So that we need to support and accelerate. And that's where government funding and support needs to go, in doing things differently, where we can build quicker, cleaner, better, rather than just trying to do what the Chinese are doing in America, which is really difficult to compete with. The other thing we can do, and this might sound improbable, but we can outspend the Chinese. Not necessarily with state funding, but by state incentivization or regulation or encouragement of private sector sources of funding, the Blackstones and the BlackRocks of this world, to deploy capital in areas such as critical minerals that are ones of national strategic imperative. And we're not doing that. These big institutions are ignoring our industry, because historically it's been considered to be an ESG and PR risk, and therefore best left to somebody else, i.e. the Chinese. And that's irresponsible. We also need to find ways to incentivize or regulate or encourage US industry to support the supply chains, the GMs of this world who, need to secure critical minerals inputs to ensure their industrial competitiveness, to ensure jobs and growth in the United States and their future existence relative to Chinese and European competition, are doing very little to take equity risk in the supply chain to secure preferential access to product, because they're conservative big organizations who don't move as quickly as the United States needs them to move to play the role they need to play for the United States' future success and growth and security. And there's therefore a lot we need to do differently.
Manel, maybe I might just ask you to wrap up briefly, and maybe Mr. Combs, just a very brief answer, and we can come back to it in the second round if we need to.
Thank you. Ultimately, the United States does not need nearly the same degree of mineral resource as China, because it is not a manufacturing-led economy in the same way. It is not a sizable domestic economy in terms of production of these goods, because it's a smaller population and needs. And so in many ways, one thing I would encourage is that the US does not need access to the places with the greatest reserves. They need access to the lowest risk reserves. And they need access to partners who can help with the integration of supply chains to reduce the costs of mitigating those risks. This does not mean the U.S. has to go to the cobalt and the DRC. It can go to other places where there are lower risks. There are costs associated with risks. And so one is that piece. The other is to recognize that these goods are by and large undifferentiated. One of the issues, whether that really means, is that these are unusual markets, but they are markets. I'm not concerned ultimately about China trying to cut off the world. What China is interested in primarily with these markets is to ensure that its downstream industry has what it needs at low cost to be competitive. And it'll weaponize that to this extent it needs. But also there are other producers, there are other suppliers, and China itself benefits from having some competition as well. So recognizing this ecosystem we're in, it is very market oriented, even with the state backing. We need to operate in that ecosystem, looking for the lowest risk, not necessarily the highest yield in terms of total value. And that goes for innovation too. We can create innovative methods, but if they're not low cost, they're not competitive. And so that's the key, is all power to the innovation, but we need low cost sources, and I think that comes from partners.
Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Logan, I think I heard in your opening statement that you recommended the idea of a commission, or some commissioner, Congress direct a report on a number of things. I love reports. My question would be to you, do we already know the answers, and what do you think the answer should be?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so what I was recommending is that Congress commission an updated report specifically on the risks of decoupling from China on new energy technologies. I think that we've commissioned a number of reports on the dominance of Chinese industries, how they got there. We have a pretty good understanding of China's domestic economy, the different drivers, whatnot. But I think where we're uninformed is on the risks of the path that we're taking in terms of de-risking and or decoupling, and what that looks like in practice and how that plays out in the near term. Thank
you, Ms. Logan. You've been listening to the other witnesses, and I've noticed you've been nodding your head and shaking your head. I always enjoy witnesses and the nonverbals. I'd love to sort of hear your reaction to the other panelists and your neighbors here, and some of the things they're saying, because I think a lot of people agree with what they're saying. I'd be interested in just your view on whether or not you share those views on critical minerals, on the the energy crisis, dependence on Chinese for a variety of other goods. What's your view?
Thanks again for the acknowledgement of my reactions. So I agree that we're in a really challenging situation in terms of China's dominance of a lot of supply chains for critical new energy technologies, and that the pathway to de-risking and protecting American interests in both the near term and the long term is really difficult, really challenging, and that we're not doing enough to invest specifically in some of what's needed, especially from the processing perspective for critical minerals and rare earths. I think that we've put a lot of attention on sourcing in the first place, but not enough attention on the full supply chain. For instance, also, there's a report yesterday or earlier this week in the New York Times about a rare earths mine, I believe in Brazil, that was invested by Americans in part, but they couldn't basically get contracts for their exports to be processed by U.S. or ally facilities because China had basically already locked in the processing for a number of years into the future, even though that mine, I believe, was invested by Americans in part. So I think all things considered, the strategy in the near term as it relates to some of these risks needs a lot more attention. At the same time, I also think that we need to right size where there are critical security risks as it relates to the trade-offs with other goals such as the energy transition, as well as economic priorities and job creation. And I think that there are ways to do that could in part leverage some of the techniques that China has used to adopt technology transfer for their benefit, in reverse for our own benefit as well.
Thank you. Mr. Combs and Ms. Logan. I think you partly just answered this, Ms. Logan, but I'm going to ask the question anyways, just to give you another chance and give Mr. Combs an opportunity. So do we have a critical mineral rare earth crisis, or do we have, like, we can't find them, we're running out of them, China has them all, or do we have a refining crisis? I think we have, or might have both. Ms. Logan, well, actually go Mr. Combs, then Ms. Logan.
There are layered risks on different time horizons. And I think this is why we'll hear some people say, no, we're fine, because we are still producing a lot of the things.
Hold on. What are the layers?
Layers, yes. Immediate term, there are stockpiles, we're good for a few months. Medium term, a lot of the things that we need, we actually don't import directly and then produce. Permanent rare earth magnets mostly flow through Japan, South Korea, especially Japan, and some China, but we can get that elsewhere as well. Longer term, if things escalate to the point where Beijing attempts to enforce long-arm jurisdiction, which would mean in this case, for example, prohibiting Japanese or retaliating against Japan and Korea and South Korea for exporting said intermediate goods containing Chinese minerals, that would be a much bigger risk. Now, there are a lot of reasons that are very clearly against Beijing's interest to do that, except in an extreme case of, very, very high, very intense trade and economic conflict. That is basically what they've been warning is the ultimate sign, and they have very clearly indicated they do not want to reach that, but that is ultimately the end.
Do I have a mineral crisis or a refining crisis?
Right now, primarily refining. The processing is the worst.
Ms. Logan?
Don't have much to add. I also agree that it's more of a refining crisis if you had to pick at the end of the day rather than a supply crisis.
Okay. That's helpful. My dear friend, Mr. Miller, asked a question about giving you unlimited resources to solve the problems. I'm going to constrain you by saying it's highly unlikely that Mr. Miller's scenario becomes true or Commissioner Miller's scenario becomes true. It's much more likely that you're able to take a number of small incremental steps, some that the executive branch can take unilaterally and some that require congressional action. Ms. Logan and Mr. Combs, what are the baby steps that we could make, either through executive action or through congressional legislation, that don't require sort of, running into a political headwinds, but where, people across the aisle can sort of hold hands and, jump into the swimming pool together?
I think if there were easy solutions, we would have taken them. I think if there were solutions that didn't face massive political headwinds, we would have taken them. So obviously, I would like to give a constructive answer, but I want to be realistic about the issues here.
That's a dark answer, Mr. Combs.
I know.
Ms. Logan, let's get some optimism here for some 5 baby steps.
So I'm afraid that I also don't have much optimism as well, but I think, where we've gotten to in terms of the current trade situation with China, I think at the end of the day, I would say that China is interested in coming to some sort of constructive resolution from a trade perspective. And in that regard, one of the aspects to consider from that is what I referenced earlier in terms of how we leverage this opportunity to benefit the U.S. domestic economy and take advantage of some of China's know-how and technology where we don't necessarily have that ability yet to do so domestically. So in that sense, I am supportive of reverse tech transfer requirements for Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States, and I think that's something that could potentially see support.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands.
Yeah. Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, I'd like to start with you. Does the federal government currently have the legal authority to mandate corrective measures of the sorts that we've been discussing those steps be taken by power companies around the country? Does it have the power to do that?
Thank you for the question. Short answer is yes, but only for a limited number of utilities. Currently, through the Energy Policy Act of 2005, Section 215, that gives FERC the authority to create the Electric Reliability Organization and create mandatory and enforceable cybersecurity standards for what's known as the bulk electric system. That bulk electric system is 100 kV and higher, which is transmission. And then in the generation space, that's going to be 75 MVA aggregate at a point of interconnection. So those are generally larger transmission and larger generation companies. And that was done to protect the bulk system. We're looking at a situation where there are many other aspects to the power grid now that go beyond just those bulk elements. So the short answer is yes, but only for some players.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Combs, you've described how China might use or has used its control of supply chains for certain critical minerals to respond to or to retaliate against the United States or other countries that are doing things it doesn't like. Have you considered the possibility that China at some point might use its control for offensive or coercive purposes? Have they not done that yet simply because the occasion hasn't arisen? Or do you think there's some reason why they would just not do that under any circumstances, to be the first mover?
My sense right now is that Beijing is in a very defensive position in two regards. One is that its economy is still struggling. It cannot afford to start conflicts that'll inherently undercut its economic interests and growth. And the other is as a much broader, more strategic pivot. It's trying to move up the value chain. It has a massive ongoing economic upgrading effort, the central piece of which is industrial upgrading. Effectively, the more trade for China, the better. And so anything that cuts off trade, namely when it cuts off trade, there are retaliatory measures to it, for example. I think that is when I speak of it being defensive, it's that ultimately it wants more trade, not less. And so it'll use trade as a tactic when it thinks it's basically when the downsides of that are less bad than the threats it's already facing. So, yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, please. There are certainly circumstances, but it is down the list of possibilities by a significant way.
Okay. Ms. Logan, I wanted to ask you about the manufacturing part of China's activities particularly in the developing world. What kinds of manufacturing facilities have they been building there? To what extent are the countries in which those facilities are located gaining value from those facilities? And to what extent is China actually transferring knowledge and technology to the countries in which it's building those facilities?
Thank you for the question. So I believe there were three parts. I'll start with the first part, which is what types of facilities are those? So what I've looked at in my research so far are critical new energy technologies, which include solar, electric vehicles, batteries, as well as wind technology. And the figures that I raised were that last year, China committed approximately, I think, 58 billion in terms of direct investments in manufacturing facilities just last year. And those facilities, as they'll be built, could have a potential output value of around 111 billion in total, which, to make the point, that rivals what we're seeing already in terms of the value of exports from China domestically on those new energy technologies. The second part of the question and third parts in terms of whether countries are deriving any sort of value from those investments, and then also in terms of requirements that they may be imposing. I would say, first of all, one of the notable aspects of these investments as compared to Belt and Road investments and engagement is that many of them employ vast majority local labor, 80 to 90% as compared to the Belt and Road, where if we looked at the overall engagement figures for last year for energy, 90% if you combine investments with construction contracts, 90% of the value of engagement of the 40 billion that went to energy was for construction contracts, which is basically China exporting its labor. So it's not basically, contributing to value-added manufacturing in those economies. So in terms of creating local jobs and other benefits for those economies, I would say, yes, these facilities are playing a role in that. The question of reverse tech transfer, I think, is something that we have not yet seen, sort of from a broad perspective, and that's a remaining question. I think, whether or not Chinese companies are willing to do that, as well as whether or not the Chinese government may place restrictions on that, are also open questions. And we've seen an example with China, the government stepping in on a BYD proposed investment in Mexico from that perspective. So I'd say those are still open questions as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes left. Does anybody have a second round question? All right. In that case, I will turn it over to Commissioner Goodwin to close us out.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands. He said he had to defer to me for the closing since the gavel's on this side of the microphone. But in closing, thank you all again for your excellent testimony today. You can find those testimonies as well as a transcript and recording of today's hearing on the Commission's website. I'd like to note that the Commission's next hearing on key U.S. supply chain vulnerabilities and the impact of a second China shock is scheduled to take place on Thursday, July 5th. With that, we stand adjourned.